Well, it's all right. We'll get the same feedback, if not more feedback. And to be completely fair, every time we do this, no matter how many people we hit, the discussion's always different. So, no, even some people that come the second, third time around, they come back with different ideas, different concepts, and they throw it out there. And I mean, if you guys want, we can go through it line by line, talk about every section. But that's with a lot of questions and a lot of discussion. Like, for the most part, the definitions we kind of spoke to that pretty good, and then it gets to when it gets to certain points, the term and how many pounds go. That needs some discussion, and then the rest of it's in the logistical stuff about like how election takes place and when you're gonna. Well, see what we can do because we've gotten different dynamics in every event that we have. So what we do is we gauge it and we start with the definitions and then after the definitions we kind of people start to get comfortable and they start to ask more questions about certain things. And then we jump from all over. But where we have an agreement this time, we can bring a legal perspective on some of the things that we're working. He'll also bring other concepts from other communities, election codes that he's worked on. So, and then you guys can ask him questions speaking about some of the oh, I don't know. Yeah, I tried on your phone. No way. I do not. Italian. I might have head, sweater, hat, t-shirt. See, that's what my wife sent me. Let me see. To the box. There might be a box here. I got a pen and a pencil. Yes, we got a lot of that. Put it in my kind of welcome election video to everybody here that we've been approached already from community members stating that you're taking our rights away to vote and so on and so forth. So we need to read that. There's nothing in here that says you can take vote, but we have been discussing on how that would work. Whether or not we've gone from we've got a 2 year term, whether it's going to be 2 year term, you have to come over there. That's their position. This is what where during our discussions we have status two, and individuals stating the people that status quo. We have individuals looking at how a hybrid system, so that way um, for those individuals who are actively taking part in our elections or they're engaging the community on a weekly basis. We have, some of us soccer family members who are in Toronto every once a week, so they know what's going on. We talked about having a system where you come home to vote or you request to vote. So instead of us just mailing out a mass mail out ballot, you have to say, I'm on the vote to do that. My name is Mike Ivor. I'm moving to Edmonton. I passed for this moment. I can validate and come to vote and be a ballot. Like, that's it. And then this eliminates the additional. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. But I'm just gonna not calling in just well, some people that they do. Look at Puncho and Helen's daughter. She's in Jersey. That'll cost her about 3 grand to get them to come over. something that we've discussed a few times at this meeting. And how was that? No mail? Yeah, well, as of right now, that's the way that we have addresses to people who just send them. Yeah. And that actually could be yeah, well, even people who voted early, mail them back. And so if you wanted to vote early, you go to the mail office to get to see every vote. Yeah. I'll try to speak up. Yeah, yeah. Let's go for no, and then that's been expressed. Every session we've had, somebody's brought that up. So one of the things that we talked about in regards to that specific issue is that when you send out notice of election, okay, so we are obligated by the code of that we have to send. We have to allow everybody to vote. So it's our responsibility to notify them. Well, we don't proactively do that, but CETA does have this. Everybody who does, whether they're all up to date, that's not actually. I'll tell you right now, that's not the case because individuals have moved and they haven't notified us. Every time we send a ballot out, we get boxes and boxes back. Return to sender because either the person moved, they didn't notify us, and the person who actually got the ballot or the information said, I don't know. Yeah.
Is that improved because of the per capita distribution?
Oh, sorry, this is Easier Andre, who's our lawyer on this file, and he's lawyer. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, that's no problem. But yes, when the settlement happened, and this is kind of tying into our position, where we had people coming out of the woodwork all over that we've never seen, that never been here, that found out they had ties, and they applied for their status, got it, and then they got on our ballot. That was a really key contribution. We had about 900 people additional in those 6 months added to our ballot because of it. Now, whether these people have still maintained active engagement in what we're doing, that's yet to be seen. But with the suggestion of a hybrid model, they'll get notified that we are having an election. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to a sweat because they could see it, say, I don't know what this is, but somebody who has actively participated in community events or actively participated in previous elections, they're going to be the ones to say, you know what?
You, and then I had it muted. That's my fault. And then to tell her that you need to come home, spend the extra $200 to $300 because it's not too much to come, but for somebody who's still trying to figure out to make that extra $300 just to pay rent, that's a significant amount of money, right? I use Hillary as an example. She does not drive, so when she was in Ottawa, she couldn't get and say, oh, I'm gonna, get a drive home, or I'm gonna drive home and pay the gas. She would have had to go to a bus, a train, and so it becomes costly. So with this model that we are just throwing out there, because again, none of this is decided, and one of the things, Sue, where it's one of your first sessions, I've stated openly more than once that if at the end of this consultation, if every capital letter, bold letter, period, comma is changed, that's okay. So we change it as we get feedback, and we hope to formulate it as best as possible with the feedback that we do get. It's not just based on the community sessions that we have here. We've got surveys, we have the videos from past sessions are out there. So people can, if you haven't had any experience with this until now, you can go back and watch our last 2 sessions and get information and hear what the comments were and the suggestions were, and so on and so forth. So if you guys like, again, depending on the experience, we can go through some of the definitions, or do you guys have specific questions that you want to ask? I know Sue, you had mentioned in regards to the offers or voting. Is there anything else that people have seen? I know Ali's probably going to help me and feed through, some of this stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slightly probe through even some of the definitions. One of the things that was brought forward, and I had to consult with legal on this, is that in order to be a candidate, we list the criteria, which is on page 1, and it's 1.1b is the main focus of what I'm going to be going on about this time around, is a Mi'kmaq of Listuguj ancestry. So with that being said, there was some confusion because of my lack of knowledge at that point. Was what does that mean? Does that mean, is it somebody who's lived here all their life, or is it just a band member, or so on and so forth? So what I've deterred, or what I've understood based on the information that I've received, is that it's an individual who has lineage, biological lineage, adopted lineage, or traditionally adopted lineage. Because we do have situations where doorstep babies were pretty common back in the day, and they were still raised. They are community members. Some of them know the language, and they grew up here, so they're considered to be a Mi'kmaq of Listuguj ancestry. Now, somebody who wouldn't be would be an individual who transfers over yesterday. They transferred over yesterday. They got their band number transferred, and then they want to run. But from what I understand, and I'm not 100% on this, I got this from a former counselor, that in order to be accepted at chief and council level, you have to have some form of lineage. I'm not 100% on that, but that's just some of the information I got. It also deters the individuals who married previous to 1985 and got status from running. But 1985. Back when, if they married a non-native woman and she attained status, and so on and so forth. This does not impact who can vote. It's just who can run in an election as a candidate. So that was something that I try to emphasize on, because there was some confusion on that in the past. One of the other things that it's brought up in here is the concept of, for 1.1e, is not being found guilty of an offense pursuant to criminal code 5 years prior to the date of the election. So we do have a lot of community members who have been, convicted at some point in time, but 5 years is something that we can kind of move off to the side and say, that's an adequate amount of time gap to justify, sure, you're done, you've either learned your lesson, and so on and so forth. No, that's no problem at all. Hillary, do you mind moving that over this way a little bit? Because I tend to want to gravitate to everybody, and then I'm out of frame, and then people can't see me. That's fine. And if they have any concerns, or sorry, I'm just going to address you personally. If anybody who's tuning in online has any concerns and they can't hear some of the questions that are being asked, please let us know in our chat, and we will do our best to reiterate questions, so that way you are fully immersed and fully engaged in the conversation. So I also encourage you to ask questions. If you have anything that you want to ask us or comments to make, you can do it through our chat, and we will ensure that they get asked at some point in time during the consultation. So moving back into that, is there anybody who would have any either objection, suggestion, or anything in regards to not having committed a criminal offense within the last 5 years? previous to the election.
Well, if you allow me a comment that always has to be made clear.
Yes, sir.
In the criminal system in Canada, there's two types of offenses. There's criminal acts or summary conviction. Summary conviction are the lesser offenses. Break and entering, breach of the probation, and so uh, it's those infractions that usually you will not go to jail. You will get some conditions, probation, community work, stuff like that, like impaired driving. And then you have the criminal offenses, which are serious. Those are the serious offenses: murder, rape, theft over 5,000, stuff like that. And what you have to know is, in between those brackets of very serious offense and the lesser, the Crown has discretion over what we call hybrid infractions. So the Crown has a choice to go with summary conviction or criminal offense, depending on the evidence, depending on the gravity, depending on the previous record from the person. So here, I want to be clear, because often people don't understand that it's not because somebody has a criminal file that is not eligible to run. It will really depend if he's being found guilty of a criminal offense or summary conviction. If it's summary conviction, you can run. Let's say that 5 years ago or 4 years ago, somebody had a little too much to drink and got caught impaired driving, pleaded guilty with a summary offense. You will see that he has a criminal record, but a criminal record will show that it was under summary conviction. But that person will be eligible to run.
Drinking and driving, would you still be allowed to do that?
Yeah.
Is that criminal? No.
Is that?
That's not criminal?
No, if it's a summary conviction,
Yeah.
you will, and this is where the terms are important. You will have a criminal record, but not because necessarily committed a criminal offense. Because in both cases, summary conviction or criminal offense, you will get a criminal record that you can ask a pardon, and then it's going to be erased. But in the meantime, but let's say you want to cross the border, they don't care if it's a criminal offense or summary conviction. As soon as you're showing a criminal record, you're not going to cross the border. But because I've seen in the past, when the communities don't understand that properly, some candidates will be disputed because an opponent will say, hey, he has a criminal record. You shouldn't be allowed. So it's going to be, has to be very clear when the returning officer will be appointed that whenever a candidate shows a criminal record, to make sure that it's not a criminal offense 5 years prior to the date of election. So let's say the election is June 5th, 2020. Well, as long as the record is prior to June 4th, 2015, things to go. Right?
Even if it was
even a criminal offense. So there's two standards. A criminal offense, 5 years prior to the election, within the 5 years. So if you're out of the 5 years, you can run.
Right.
So
what if you have the drink and driving in 3 years?
It's a summary conviction.
If it's a summary conviction, then it's fine.
Okay, you can still run.
Yeah. So, for our off reserve members, because they can't hear too much from my lapel, our lawyer was just essentially describing that there's two types of charges that can be laid on an individual in regards to this. One is criminal, and one is summary. And summary convictions are normally the lesser charges. One of the examples that was used was drinking and driving, and then criminal conviction is larger offenses like murder, rape, theft over $5,000. So we need to be very clear, and I need to be very clear as well, making sure that when I tell you, the off-reserve community, and the community members that are here, that just because a person has a criminal record doesn't deter them from being able to run. They have to have a criminal record that has a criminal conviction in order for them to not be able to run. Also within 5 years of the past election. So and then the example that the legal counsel gave was that if the next election is in June 5th, to 2020, he or she cannot have a criminal conviction from June 4th, 2015 or earlier. Anything after that is fine, but anything earlier will not, they won't be eligible to run.
And there's another technical issue. I don't want to get too technical, but keep in mind that being found guilty is a process that can be appealed. So we have to look at the date of the final decision. So you could have Court of Appeal, you can even have Supreme Court of Canada. So it's the last date that has confirmed the guilty of it. So even if you have a Court of Quebec decision, let's take the example of June 5th, 2015, if 3 years later he appealed it or she appealed the decision and got a final ruling, then the date of actually confirmation of the guilty offense will be on the date of the appeal. So it's 2 years down the line, so it will push it to 2022 rather than 2020. But I don't want to mix up people with this. So what's also important is that some of you might say, well, why are we allowing even people to run if they have a criminal record? Some communities have asked that. Well, why would we elect a chief or counselor with even a criminal record? Shouldn't we just say, if you have a criminal record, you cannot run? Your elected people or some people have blocked roads or have done demonstrations for oil projects and stuff like that and have been arrested and convicted. So in order not to punish them for defending the territory, the land, or the way of life,
warriors.
Right. So you create this exception of a lesser charge. But I'm going to give you an example where we had a case where the person got convicted of a criminal offense because he was accused and charged of creating a riot. Because the story was some police came to a community to arrest drug dealers.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people came out of the community and said, "I'll come to police in our community." So they encouraged people to come out and go after the police. So those people were arrested and charged with initiating riots and other accusations, but those were criminal offenses. So that the community said this is beyond what would be acceptable to us, and this is where we draw the line because of it's a criminal offense. But at the same time, we would not suggest that we put in the code unless you've been charged for protecting the territory. It's too difficult to define. So you just leave it between those two categories of a lesser offense versus a more serious offense. And that's your standard. What you can live with as a summary conviction versus a criminal act, which is way more serious. And that becomes your standard.
Yes.
So one of the questions I have is with the 5-year wait period.
Yes.
So say we have someone who was found guilty of a criminal offense. They the example I'm going to use is like if they're found guilty of sexual assault.
Yes.
And they end up on the registry.
Yeah.
So at this point, it's 6 years. Are they still eligible to run?
Yeah.
Okay. So with that, is there any way that we can say that because of the position that they're running for, if you are convicted of one of those offenses where you end up on a registry for like 20, 25 years, that you're not eligible to run? Because like the way that I see it is that if you are in a position of power, and if you've already violated that kind of
Yep.
like that trust between people, or
Yep.
I don't think it's fair or right that they could have that type of power over someone else.
Absolutely, and that's something that we've made reference to in the and we asked, because I remember during our sessions with public security that it was actually brought up in regards to possibly having extensions. So we have it as 5 years, but depending on the nature of the offense, it could be extended. So, but it's to work with legal and to try to find the right wording to really bring that out. Because yes, in an example like that, you definitely wouldn't want somebody like that in a position of power. One of the other examples that we used was if somebody was charged for fraud in 1980. You know what I mean? That's still something that, do you want somebody like that in a position of power? It was fraud, it was, and I mean, there's tax fraud and so on, so we'd have to define it, but if it was like fraud in excess of $100,000 or something like that, and Nadir would have to really clarify on what those parameters would look like. But those are things that we kind of want to see in there as well. But again, we'd have to make sure that we're wording it properly and as best as possible.
So, just to answer, and your point is very relevant, but there are over 400 and something offenses in the criminal code. So if we were to identify exhaustively those offenses that after the 5 years would still not be able to run, that could be a challenge, but it's still possible. We can address it in terms of sex offender registry. If it's limited to that issue, we can certainly put it as long, because we can put plus in a case of an offender registered under that registry. It would be as long as the person's name is under the registry, will not be eligible. We could add it on. Just so you know that the 5 years is not something that pop out of my mind. It's the legal term to request a pardon.
Okay.
It's 5 years after the offense. So that's why we use 5 years. So whether or not the person has asked a pardon is not relevant. He may have or may not have. It costs a lot of money, it can take some time. But at least if somebody asks, why 5 years? Well, technically, after 5 years, you can ask for a pardon. So if you can ask for a pardon, you can certainly ask to run again. And don't forget the third element. It's the element of character. Because even if the person has committed, let's say has committed murder, everybody knows it. Everybody knows what happens in the community. Even after 10 years, the person wants to run. Will the people vote for him because of the offense? Regardless if he technically can run, will the people vote for a person who's committed a serious crime? And it's something that can be brought by the opponent, because a criminal record is public. You go to the courthouse, you put the name and the date of birth, and it's a public information. Everybody's entitled to receive it. So I know in some communities, the opponents go to the courthouse, get the list of the, and they pull everything out to make sure that they're eligible in case somebody's trying to hide the information. And that's why we added this sentence at the end of the term. It's not up to the returning officer to go run to the courthouse and figure that out. Each candidate has to prove that they don't have such a record.
Yeah.
So it's up to the candidate to bring that evidence. If they don't, they're disqualified.
So since we were originally talking about offers as lawyers and the review for that, we went off to a different thing. No one could see anything that wasn't said by you.
Yes.
Someone interpreted that we asked, like, so this means I can't run for student council, but you mentioned effective offender registration. I don't think this person is on.
Oh, okay. So they didn't. Okay, so our apologies, and this is going to be very, very problematic, and I apologize everybody in here, and I apologize to you at home. We don't have microphones that is going to gauge everybody's comments here, so if you come into the stream late, I apologize, and just let us know if you want something to be reiterated. What we are talking about at this point, for anybody who has it in front of them, it's definitions in 1.1e, which is talking about that a candidate has not been found guilty of a criminal offense pursuant to criminal code 5 years prior to the date of election. Now, I won't go through all of it because, again, you can reference this when you look at it online. It can be found on our website. What we can probably do is provide you a link, and we'll send it right directly to you so you can access it at the same time as we're going through it. So the question, again, you had mentioned was they can't run? No, yeah, we were talking about one specific section. We actually haven't got into the whole discussion about off-reserve members and so on and so forth. But rest assured, we will get there. So just moving forward again with definitions, unless anybody has any questions in regards to that. No? We're good? Feeler? All right. Definition of chief, counsel, council member, counselor, criminal code, criminal offense, which is kind of what we went through a little bit here with Nadir. The deputy electoral officer, who that person is, rules around who that person can be, election code, elector, as you may or may not know, is just anybody who is registered on our ban list who is over the age of 18 at the time of the election. Our electoral list is a list of those people.
I just noticed something, if you go back to 1.9.
Yeah, election it says 13, but we're at 8.
We're now at 8?
Yes, sir. Well, actually, no, sorry, we're at 9.
9.
Yeah, 9 elected officials. And we actually wrote that down in one of our notes, and I think we forgot to submit that, so that's our fault. So elector is just an individual who's on our ban list who is 18 years or older at the time of the election. Electoral list is the list of those people. Electoral officer is the person who is mandated to run the election. The ED, as some of us who was at the meeting this afternoon, is the executive director of the LMG, or senior director, or chief executive officer, director general, however that wants to. Yes, and we'll get to that as we go through, and I'll explain why as well. General Assembly means General Assembly of its members, essentially what we did this afternoon. Listuguj, our community, LMG is the Listuguj Mi'kmaq government, majority vote. Means 50% plus 1 of the votes cast for each position. Member is somebody who's on our membership list. Membership clerk is the individual who maintains that list. Notice of election, very procedural. The election will be done here, the dates of the advanced polling, the date of the election, so on and so forth. It just lists what is required. Order in council is a resolution that we pass. Need a longer stick. A vacancy. Now, a vacancy is when a position, either chief or council, becomes vacant and there's nobody holding that position. This could be done by, as it's shown here, if they resign, meaning that if he or she informs council in writing that they are that their resignation, or if they miss 3 consecutive regular council meetings with no justification. For more certainty, such a resignation shall become official and effective on the date that council in session puts the resignation on its agenda and acknowledges said resignation. Now, we've already seen that once over when Lloyd stepped down. He gave his formal resignation at the table, they accepted it, and we went.
So there's just one technical thing, I want to spend 30 seconds here.
Yes, sir.
Contrary to what the Indian Act regulation right now, when somebody misses more than 3 consecutive meetings, it's not a resignation. You have to write to the minister, and the person has the opportunity to present excuses to the minister, and the minister will make a final decision based on the 3 consecutive meetings that have been missed. Here, it would be automatic. It's not going to be, because once this code is adopted, there's no more Indian Affairs and minister looking over this election. It becomes totally self-sufficient.
It comes under the First Nations Elections Act, doesn't it even do it all it's customary?
No, it's not a First Nation Election Act. This is your customary election code.
But you're taking some of the things out from the First Nations Elections Act and putting them in here, but you're leaving a whole bunch of them out.
Wow.
But that's the whole point. We're not going to reinvent the wheel.
First Nations Election Act for some of the things they have in here.
No. We didn't use, we used different models, and it's a good point that you're making. The model that we're presenting, because there's hundreds of customers, hundreds of them, right? So the model that we use as a template is those we present to the First Nations like you that are pulling out of the Indian Act. So instead of proposing something that's fundamentally different to what you're being used to for decades, we're more or less proposing almost the same system with few changes. But the whole point is that you can already right now, and this is the whole point of the process, personalize this code and say, well, I don't recognize myself with this, I recognize myself with that, and I would rather have this and that. So either you do it now, or what you're going to be able to do as years go by is you'll be able to personalize the code until such time that it becomes really your customary belief. For instance, you have elections in some communities where it's you're not electing council. You're electing a chief in your clan, in your family. For instance, when that came to the Euro village, that's how they operate. So the seaweed elect a chief among the seaweed. So you don't vote for the next family. You don't vote for the next council. In Akwesasne, a Mohawk community, you vote for a district, like a municipality. So you don't vote for 6 or 7 councillors. You vote for your councillor in your neighborhood, and he will represent your district. And that's it. And then you have another vote for the grand chief. So there's, and then there's other places you vote for a council of elders. Instead of voting for young people or it's just elders that are running and can be on the council. So there's a whole bunch of different models out there. And it wouldn't work if we try to mix things up. We're going to take a little bit of this and a little bit of that and make a salad. It wouldn't work. But at the same time, so we're proposing a basic model, a basic 101, your own election. But you will see, some of them who have started with that, after 20 years, 25 years, their code is now 100 pages. Because they added things that they say, hey, yeah, let's think about that. Let's allow the officers to vote through a different system and even let's have a position of council for the officers. They go to that extent. There's some places a youth has to be elected, a woman has to be elected, and an elder has to be elected. You have special position for those categories on top of the others. Yeah. So you have so many possibilities that eventually the code gets amended and gets fancier and fancier.
Just from a perspective, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's only maybe 11 communities within Canada that actually still run under the Indian Act elections.
Yeah.
It's a small number. So out of every other First Nation community in Canada, there's only around 11-ish that still run under the INAC process.
But this option only started in 2014, as far as getting away from the Indian Act and going into the First Nations Elections Act. That's where the 4-year term comes from.
Okay, but let's be careful here. Okay, that information is very important. So the Indian Act, okay, in the definition of this is a customary, it would be your custom code under the Indian Act.
I know, but there's some things that were taken up from the First Nations Elections Act. For example, the removal of councillors and the chief. You're using that part from the First Nations Elections Act. That's what it is. That's where it's coming from.
The title is there, but we did not use the model that's in the First Nation. It's because
it's almost the same, pretty well.
Well, and then again, that goes without saying. Again, like we mentioned, there's well over 100 models. Now, do we really anticipate at this point that each one of those models across Canada is completely and utterly different? No, they won't be, because they're going to pick what works for them based on what's and it goes to a point where you're just not reinventing the wheel anymore. That works, so we're going to use it. This works, so we're going to use it.
When you're going to present the final product to the minister, because there's the next step. If this is agreed by the community, you have to go back to the minister, and the minister will look at it. And if he likes it, He's going to put a stamp saying, all right, from now on, you're no longer under the Indian Act. You now have your own code. If the minister doesn't like it, he's going to send it back to say, I've issued. I'm going to give you the four criteria that the minister is looking at. One, it has to respect the Charter of Rights. First criteria that the minister looked at. Looked at when he looked at the code. The second, officers have to be able to vote and run. That's the second criteria he's going to look at. It doesn't say that you have to send the ballots over there. It doesn't say nothing. But they have to be able to vote and run.
Yeah.
The third one is that there has to be an appeal process to challenge the election. And the fourth one, there has to be a removal process. So what we're talking about is not just under the First Nation Election Act, the removal and the appeal. It's already a condition that the minister wants even for a customary code. And that's why it has to be in there. Otherwise, it's not because there's existing provision in the First Nation Election Act. It's because the minister, if he doesn't see that, he's going to send it back here and say, I cannot approve it. But that's the last time he's going to approve it, because once it's approved, then it's up to you. So if you're removing after once you amend it, and you people say, well, we don't want a removal anymore and the appeal anymore, you can remove it and the minister cannot say anything. It's only the first time you're going to present it the first time, he's going to want to see this. But after that, you become sovereign to amend this thing. But what he's going to want to see is also the way that you're going to amend it. Because in some cases, I'm going to give you an example, they just said the code can be amended by an OIC from the council. So that the minister, when he sees that, no, it's too easy. If the bank council can modify this thing. Other places, they put a general assembly with no quorum. The minister says, means you call friends, 5 people in the room and you amend the thing? No. So that's why they ask that even for the amendment, there has to be a quorum. There has to be a minimum number of people that will agree to change the thing. It has to be hard enough, but at the same time, I'm going to give you the example of, you know, a new community called Petanet? Federal court said that election is illegal, the code is illegal. It took 2 years when you won. And the court said, I canceled the election back to the old code because you did not respect the quorum that was in there. So be careful what number you put in there, because if the number is impossible to reach, you're going to be stuck with that version without ever being able to modify it. So it has to be a balance between too easy and too hard, find something in between.
Yeah. So
Some people commenting that they can't hear me.
yeah, and again, I apologize. Oh, am I on? Yeah, I'm on. And again, I apologize. We don't have the microphone set up. Our technical person is not feeling well, so we don't have. I'm not familiar with the equipment that's in front of us here now, so we tried to set something up earlier to possibly have our boom mic so that way we can hear everybody. But unfortunately, they couldn't even hear me standing here. So we can't. I apologize. I haven't received messages, and I think I might know who you're referring to because I think they messaged me as well. I apologize for that, but unfortunately, there's nothing we can do at this point. What we may try to do, depending on the nature of what goes on, we may end up having a sit-down session if possible, depending on his availability, and we'll just record some of the answers that he's been given, so we can possibly just publish that, depending. Unless I want to share my microphone, is that a recommendation from the individual, or because the lapel mic, it would be very, very difficult to pull and push and pull. I'm not entirely sure. If you pick it up, you want to cuddle?
No, I mean, like, if you were to just, like, take it out of your shirt.
Yeah, just pass it over.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay, is this good? You guys all right with that? I should text him back and be like, "Is this satisfactory, sir?" Okay, so again, based on that, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. There is some stuff, like you said, that is familiar, and as Nadir mentioned, that there is certain provisions that have to be in there, and that's that's similar to every other code across the country. That those provisions have to be there in order for it to get adopted. We have to respect human rights. Charter of Rights. Yeah.
Charter of Rights, off reserve, appeal, grounds for removal, and I forgot the fifth one, the amendment. Yeah.
You went through it, but you just didn't
Yeah.
label it as the fifth one.
Yeah.
So one of the other things that we have going through here again is the concept of vice chief. This is something that we kept the terminology in there at this point just to spark the conversation. One of the things that we've been talking about in regards to that is similar to your chief counselor. So the person who gets the most votes, this person is chief counselor. Now, over the past, I want to say 6 years-ish, that concept has not been utilized for the most part. What chief and councils over the past little while have been doing is just they've been mandating and proxying individuals as they're available. In this current administration, the person who got chief counselor actually didn't accept the title of chief counselor. They just stated that they are in one vote at the table. There is no difference between them or any other members of council. We've had individuals state that, you know, that's how everything's always been done, so why don't we keep it that way? In different sessions that we've had, we've pitched running for a specific position. So we asked individuals, you know, what's your thoughts on, you know, running as a vice chief, not as a counselor, but you run for the position of vice chief. If you get it, you get it. If you don't, you don't. And some people, they get where it's coming from, but from the most part, and based on some of the survey data that we got, and that addresses your concern earlier, where it's 5 people that are here, but we have well over 200 people taking one survey, and then we're working on getting another set of individuals for the second survey. So we're at least about 10% of our electors, at least. And these surveys are still open. They're going to be open until the process is done. So I'd encourage anybody here, if you haven't done them, to do them. I'd encourage anybody who's online, if you haven't done them, please, I encourage you to do them. They're found on our website, as I mentioned in my introductory video. So that's one of the things where, again, in our surveys, you can determine how a vice chief is to be determined, and we can go from there.
So the 3 existing model in a nutshell for vice chief. So either it's a position that you would run as a ticket with the chief. So chief, vice chief, specific position. So that position is not a counselor. So it would, if you chose that, it would then be 1 chief, 1 vice chief, 7 counselors. And it would be specific. When you go to the ballot, you would have a candidate for chief, candidates for vice chief, and then 7 counselors. So that there's that model. Then there's the model that's similar to your chief counselor, which is the one that gets the most vote as a counselor becomes automatically the vice chief. And then the third model is that at the first council meeting, an OIC determines who will be the vice chief for the rest of the term by OIC. So it's not the one that got the most vote, but it would be decided by the council who would be the vice chief to replace the chief in case he is incapacitated.
So I have a question. So for chief, like in here, and we talked about how chief would have to be a full-time position. So for the vice chief position, if that person already holds a job, how are they supposed to fulfill their duties when they are acting as chief?
Well, one of the things that again, hopefully I got it right. Kind of caught me off guard. So if we are going to be determining that the chief's position is a full-time position, then what if this individual who's elected as vice chief has a full-time position? How are we to expect them to fulfill their mandate, essentially? And some of the feedback that we've gotten throughout these sessions, and some of the feedback that we've actually gotten through our survey results, is that the majority of the community actually want to have council members along with chief to take a leave of absence from their position that they currently hold to to fulfill their roles. And that's just based on the survey data that we have now. But depending on how things go, depending on the further consultations that we get, we could change the wording, we can change the approach depending on how they officers do that as well.
So another question would be then is how will we accommodate paying for 9 full-time counselors?
So again, for everybody, the question is how will we accommodate paying for 9 full-time counsel? That is something that I don't know. That's an administrative item that would probably be best suited from the office of the chief and counsel. From what I understand, there is currently counselors that are on a council salary or a council honorarium where they're getting compensated in some shape, way, or form for the work that they're doing. I don't have any of that personal information that's within the office, but that definitely would be something to bring forward and actually illustrate that if this is the way we decide to go, here's where the resources are going to come from. And, you know, even community members, as you were well aware, have stated in previous meetings that they would like to see that in advance. You know, how much each counselor will be receiving as compensation and what their mandate is and all of their, you know, requirements in regards to reporting and stuff like that. And I mentioned a few times in other sessions the work that our own Candice Metallic has been doing. And she's been doing a lot of work to define and really lay out what the mandate of council is, what the reporting responsibilities are to community. So my assumption is that information is to be made public. And once it is made public, then you, the people, know what is to be expected of your leadership when they do get elected.
Because I think for me, the hardest part is that we keep having this conversation about, you know, how we want them to be full-time, how we have these expectations of them, but then we don't want to pay them. We're like, oh no, they should do it because their heart's invested in it, but you know, their heart might be invested in it, but they also have to like put food on their table for their families. So it's like, I feel like as a community, like we don't know what we want. And I that's why I keep bringing it up at these conversations, because it's like, you know, we have to talk about how they're going to make a livelihood. Like, I'm not saying that they should be paid top notch and, you know, make a career out of it, but it's something that we have to consider.
Is that something that we would have to put in the code per se, or is that, again, like I mentioned, is that something logistical to where we could say, here's the amount of compensation? Because I think the only thing that's in here is that they can't exceed the salary of the ED.
But I feel like it would be in like an annex of like their roles and responsibilities. Like it would be.
I think so. Yeah, but that's not work that's being put into here. That's.
Well, I just think for conversation's sake that we need to talk about it like that.
Sure.
Because like for me, like it doesn't make sense to have a vice chief who has, you know, full-time employment, where we expect the chief to be in this role as a full-time position, and then you know, like it just it
needs to be beefed up a little bit. Yeah, no, for sure.
So between the time that we drafted the first draft of the election code, which is a couple of years ago, I think 2017 was the first draft. At the request of the councillors, we drafted the policy to allow a councillor who wants to have a full-time job to be allowed to work full-time as a councillor. So this is happening now as we speak. So simply nobody has asked me to integrate this policy into the code. It's not up to me to decide that, but so you know that there is now a written policy at LMG allowing a counselor to work full-time as a counselor, and there's conditions to it. So, and remember I gave you a copy of that policy at our first meeting. So my hopeful expectation is that this policy could be part of the discussion over the election code. And if the people who are consulted are comfortable in having this policy integrated into the chapter of compensation, then we could integrate it and we could make it as a condition that all counselors actually are full-time. And I'm going to tell you, over and above the fact of the work that they have to do, the main issue for me is the fact that we're allowing employees to run and keep their job once they get elected. And when it becomes an issue is because the employee becomes its own employer and is even on top of a supervisor to some extent. And this creates an administrative issue because, and more and more band councils are saying we cannot allow employees to run and keep their job. But at the same time, what do? Does it mean that because you work for the band, you can no longer run because you're gonna have to quit your job? So the solution was to say, all right, everybody will get a full-time job. That way you can take a leave of absence or resign, whatever the conditions are, and you're now a full-time counselor. But then you have to justify, what do you do full-time? And so in some places, some band council, the council sits full-time. There's not just a council meeting like you saw today. It's every day, like a legislator, like the Canadian Parliament. They're there all day. You know, sometimes they have committees, they have travel. It doesn't sit all the time, but most of the time they're there. And there's question period. They study policy. They receive reports. They invite directors. So they dedicate their time as a chief and council, as a collective. Other places, instead of sitting all the time, they have portfolio. They have their little office and they have files to manage: education, employment, economical development, so on and so forth. So there are a couple of models that where it would be justified that they have a full-time position. But keep in mind that they're not employees. They cannot be fired because they're elected people. So once they're on the payroll, the only thing that they have to respect is the fact that they cannot be paid to do nothing. They cannot stay at home and get a pay. So, but at the same time, you cannot fire them. Yeah. But that's why in the policy that we have, once you get a copy, because it should be public, you will see that if they don't report on their work, if they don't show up like an employee, there is a possibility through a council resolution to remove. They don't get fired. You cannot fire an elected person, but they will have their privilege, the compensation, removed until such time that they're back on the job. So they will have this tool where you control. If the person doesn't show up to work or doesn't do the work, you will be able to suspend not the salary, because it's not an employee, but it's a compensation.
Okay, now the ones that ran and they were getting the salary from the band, they were already working as an employee. Are they also going to get paid as a counselor? In other words, two salaries or one?
No. The way it is right now, the individuals that are currently that are getting compensated for their work from the band, that's their one job. They don't have something else that they're going to do. Now, we do have individuals that I believe, I don't know if they're on salary right now or on compensation right now, but they have other contracts that they do. I'm not entirely sure of what those logistics are because I'm not right into that aspect of it. But that's something that if we wanted to see that kind of laid out to say, here's your job, you're not allowed to engage in external contracts for whatever reason. This is your job, here's your responsibilities, and that's that. So that could be laid out, and we had mentioned, or Nadir had mentioned the document that he had presented to me when I first received this one. And that's probably my apologies. I completely forgot about it, and I apologize to you, and I apologize to everybody here. But we can definitely make that public. One of the things that we did at first was that we didn't want to have people too confused talking about two separate documents at the same time, and then they could run into each other, even though they do have reference to each other. We just didn't want to confuse anybody, but I think at this point we have individuals who are comfortable enough now that we can probably roll that out and really dive into that, especially around that concept and that topic. So moving forward, we'll actually get into the general provisions and the makeup of council. Now, the number of elected officials in the draft before this was 12 plus one chief, so it came up to a total of 13. Based on our survey data, and I'm already getting the look over on this end. Based on the survey data that we have, based on the amount of council who have attended duly convened council meetings over the past 3 years, and Ali has brought up the point, and it's a very, very valid point, that there was no mechanism for them to be required to be there. So the data is not 100% like concrete, because they could just show up when they wanted. If they didn't come to a meeting, then c'est la vie. There was more than that. Yeah, there's definitely more than that. So, but it's just, we took the data anyway just to give a general idea of what could be. And again, like I mentioned earlier, if we decide that we have 8 right now, but if we decide that, you know what, maybe 10 is more accurate, that's fine. But the data that I collected based on public meetings, duly convened council meetings, not including the meetings that did not attain quorum, and not including chief in these numbers, we had an average of 8.35 council per meeting for the last 3 years, since 2016.
So yeah, so like again, so taking into consideration, like those are people who just show up because they know that that's their responsibility.
Yeah.
So like, there's nothing to say that, you know, if you don't show up, you know, you'll be penalized for it or whatever. So like, I don't know, I would take that with a grain of salt.
Yeah, well, there is, but it's just not enforced.
Yeah.
Because as Nadir mentioned, according to the Indian Act, you have 3, if you miss 3 consecutive, and I believe, from what I understand, that there's a member of council currently that has missed more than 3 consecutive meetings with no excuse. So again, it gets down to where Nadir, there's a process involved. Now, with how this is made up, that process is eliminated and then it's done there at the table. So yes, the data is not, but again, it's just to give us a number based on something that we can have the discussion. And again, if it comes down where, again, we say 8 is too much and 10 or 6 or, you know, what have you, I wouldn't recommend going anything lower than 6. But we can still have the discussion, even though the data is not concrete, but it is something to support why we went with what we did. And again, the survey data that we currently have, and that one is over 200 submissions, is they 12 and 6 are the minority combined. They're under 50% combined, and then the rest from 7, 8, 9, 10 is where the community members are. So 60-some% of the community wants something other than 6 or 12. So again, based on the data, we figure we meet in the middle, and then if that dynamic changes, then we go from there. Although 8 council, even in our survey data, is actually pretty prominent. So
like one of the things that I mentioned one time is that I would support the idea of having less than 12 counselors, but only if that there is mechanisms in place that allow us to like have a youth representative, have a woman representative, and making sure that we can meet those gaps. Because I think that the more you narrow down the amount of people that you have sitting around the table, the less ideas you have around it, and you can end up with, you know, I don't know, majority of them supporting one thing that doesn't actually reflect all the wants and needs of the community. So I really don't like the idea of having less than 12. I like the idea of having 12 just because it's a little diversity.
And it's old.
Well, it's not old. Like I've sat on councils that have like 20, 25 people on it. It's just a matter of being accountable.
It's 150 years old.
But what I'm saying is it's about accountability, right? So if we have nothing that holds them accountable to attend now, we can't say that 8 is going to be more effective because we have never had those accountability mechanisms with 12. So these are people just showing up. So what I'm saying is that if we have those accountability mechanisms in place, we can keep 12, see if they follow it. If they do not, then we can make those amendments.
12 costs a lot of money. With 8, they're going to be saving it, and they're going to use that money somewhere else.
But it's less ideas.
More efficient.
no, but at the same time too, like this is again why we want to have this. This is one perspective, and then we have another perspective, right? And to engage in the dialogue and to say, okay, because for me as the facilitator, I understand exactly where she's going with this, but I also understand where you're coming from as well.
And there's also a lot of fighting and disagreements with 12.
And that was one of the things too, where I still love the analogy that was given when we met with the students. It was a very, very simplistic approach or metaphor that they kind of threw out at them, is that if you have a school project, how many is too many? So would you want to have 12 people on a school project? And then the students, I mean, just from a school project perspective, the students were like, well, no, that's too much. Like we would need this many. And that's kind of how I got the assist from one of their teachers, was to say, well, that's what we're trying to find out here. You know, and again, the ideas aren't going to be there with less people, but over time we've seen that 12 doesn't necessarily work anyway. So yeah, and that hasn't been defined at this point, right?
On a school project, you're all contributing to something equal. You're making decisions, right?
Ideally, yes.
Yes, right. You're making decisions on something. You have the ability to change.
Yeah.
Something. Whereas we're saying in our chiefing council, we want them to step away from the day-to-day things, have less authority over that kind of management, and more authority on like where we're going as a government, where we're going as a nation. So, do do you want less people sitting around the table making governance decisions, or do you want more people? Because, you know, like if we're moving away from this micromanaging,
Mhm.
you know, system, I don't want 6 people sitting around that table. I want 12, because 12 people will have more ideas.
I think, some of them just sit there anyway. We do have that popularity vote.
Yes.
Okay, we have the popularity vote, and we can all see, what's going on now.
Yes.
And, with that popularity vote, there haven't been too many meetings at this point. I don't know. I've seen some people uninterested sitting there, really uninterested, and they got this in their hands and not giving many ideas.
And I think that
They're not giving their ideas at all. They're not even paying attention with what's going on because their level of thinking is not there. They don't understand half the process of what the business is about
well,
at the meeting.
and I think what Ali's kind of alluding to at this point is just that um, if we had individuals who were committed and they came to the meetings and there was mechanisms in place to make them accountable to say, then in that case, I would agree as well. I'd say, you know what, having 12 minds who are there for a common goal, who want to progress and want to, you know, make Listuguj better, then yeah, I would say 12 would be, you know, more. But the beauty of it is that if we get, like hypothetically, we do go to 8, and then we get individuals who are elected, and these types of people, they're here for a reason. They want to do things and they want to get better. They want to progress. Then you know what? We need more capacity. We need more. There's nothing that says that based on the amendment process that we have, where we go to 10 and say, you know what, 10 council are needed now because everybody's bought into that ideology, right? So, but and again, it could be the other way around. Again, we could say 10 now and then maybe move down to 8. It's all up for debate.
The model of representation is in most cases number based. So in the Indian Act, the reason why there's 12, the rule was one counselor per 100 up to 12 maximum. So that's how you ended up with 12. There's some main council, there's 300 members, there's one chief, 2 counselors, and that's what they have. So, and in municipal law, it's the same principle. It's per district. You have a counselor per district, depending how many districts you have. Each district can be 100 people, 500 people, 1,000 people, depending the size of the city. On the provincial level, it's about 1 MP per 25,000. On the federal level, is 1 MP per 50,000. So it's with numbers. It's the criteria of idea is original, but it has never been a criteria to determine the proper number of representation. So in your case, you don't have district. The 100 per up to 12 means nothing because you're over 4,000. And so if you want to think of criteria, it could be the representation of different groups, youth, elders, women. It could be representation of off reserve, on reserve. It could be different things, and it could be sections. There's sky's the limit basically, because at the end of the day, you're going to have a number of representation. Some other in some election code, the issue is the portfolios. You know, we have 6 portfolios. We don't need 8 people. We need 6 because each of them will get a portfolio. So it also, but it's in their code. So the person is running for police and public safety. Another one is running for basically for the portfolio. So that model also exists. So there's as many positions that there are portfolio. So you have many, many options. The trick, again, is to start with a number that you can live with and that will still guarantee some representation. And then you can adjust based on what I like personally, what I like in the representation of 8-1, the quorum goes from 7 to 5. And the lesser number you have for quorum, the better chance you have to maintain quorum during the term. That mathematically. If the quorum is 3 or 5, you have more chances than if the quorum is 7 or 9 or 12 people. So it's an issue of representation as well. But 12, I mean, the council, even though there's been some problem this term, to have 7 councillors is achievable. It's not an unreasonable number either, you know. So really, you have to find a number that you'll be comfortable with. The cost is also a factor. If you're going to pay everybody $75,000-$80,000 per head, plus the equipment, plus the office space, plus the personnel, the travel expense, all that combined together, you have to count about $100,000 per person minimum.
With four less councillors, would be a million saved in 4 years.
That's it. So,
Maybe more.
yeah, because it's a 4-year term.
But you would also be saving money by taking those people away from the
money.
cost. So it's like that money would save.
But you would-
No, you have to
You would be
replace them.
saving money for specific programs, though.
No,
where-
those people that are quitting their job will be replaced by others. Those jobs you cannot just put an end to it and not replace them.
But even if they're on like so would it just be like a temporary, like a contract?
Yeah, for
Until like their 4 years.
usually, okay, and that's an important question. If it's a 4-year term, okay, you can put in a code that, all right, you can take a leave of absence for 4 years, and I think we have something of that nature. But if you're going to run again for another 4 years, maybe now you have to consider resigning because you're out of your job. You can can you stay 16 years as an elected person and then go back? Your job is waiting for you. You haven't trained. You haven't followed up your file. I mean, to what extent can you continue having this job on the side and your replacement has been there 16 years? It wouldn't make sense. So you could allow a leave of absence without pay for 4 years. But then you tell, if you run again and you win, you have to resign, type of thing. Or the job will, yeah, there has to be some statutes of limitation on the job because you cannot hold it forever, right?
So again, moving forward, one of the things, and then Nadir already mentioned that quorum in this model, quorum then does change from 7 to 5. Now, from what I understand as well, we have a quorum of 7, but that was adopted via OIC to increase it. We technically only need 5 for quorum. But we ourselves, as a government, I'm not sure exactly when this took place, but we changed it as Listuguj Mi'kmaq government to say, okay, quorum is now 7. Because even in today's, I'm not entirely sure when that was changed. No, ours it's 12 and the quorum was 5, but then, or one of them, yeah. Then they said that no, quorum is now 7. We made that decision to increase it to 7. So in this one, it would be changed to 5. And again, chief and council are elected according to this election code. And then it goes into, again, the term. So the term as of right now is 4 years. We've had various individuals who took our survey who have stated their opinions. We've also had individuals that have been in our consultations and they've said, well, what about 3 years? Instead of, so some people are very, very weary of, having a 4-year term because of, what if you elect somebody you don't like? And I think that they may not 100% understand the removal process. Some people stating that 2 years is too short. So because of that, some people are suggesting, well, maybe go 3 years to start. It's a hybrid, it's in the middle, and then we see how things work out from there. That's a possibility.
Sorry, just a step back at 2.4, just for your information. There has been a long debate in Listuguj about the right and prerogative of the chief to make proposal and support a resolution or even vote on the OIC. This time, it's going to be clear that each councilman, including the chief, may propose or second an order in council and vote on the said proposal. So this will move aside this debate, can the chief vote or not? And that's also based on case law, where when it was not specifically stated in the code that the chief could not vote, unless the custom made it that way, you had to consider that the chief, as an elected person, should be able to vote and propose resolution. There's no reason why he has to abstain from making that decision. Because if that's the case, and that's where it's linked to the number of counselors that we haven't mentioned, in order to avoid a tie, because you're having 8 counselors, you could be 4-4, then the number that you have is to break the tie. But the chief can always, you're not obligated to vote. So a chief can decide, you know what, I'm not going to vote, but that's my own decision until such time that there's a tie. But that's his own decision to do so. A chief may decide that because of 2.4, regardless if there's a tie or not, I'm always going to vote, and if I want to propose, I will propose. And the basis of this practice is that we're used to, in a non-profit organization or some companies, that the chairman or the chairwoman of the board of directors will abstain from voting to remain neutral. This is where the practice comes from. So we think that because the chief is also chairing the meetings, that he should abstain from voting or getting part of the debate. And that's what the origin is. But there's no real custom about it and no tradition to that effect. It's just something out in the air. So we decided that this should be addressed, but it's also part of the consultation. If in your mind as members, the chief should be completely neutral and not being able to vote or propose or second motions, it should also be addressed with your comfort zone and your opinion about this, the role of the chief within the council.
And just one of the things before we get there, Ali had mentioned this a few times, and she'd actually provided me with the information yesterday or the day before, in regards to a specific position of chair. Now, the chair is always neutral. They're not elected. They're hired. It's a job. It's a position, and they maintain their neutrality at meetings. They're that person. So in that way, in regards to 2.4, chief does his vote. He doesn't have any. There's no biases, or from how I'm understanding it, or wow, you definitely could.
So the idea would be that
They're not gonna hear it.
I'll do this. I'll just move around.
They don't see it either.
That's fine.
all right.
So the idea would be that for the chair, it would be a position strictly of its own. It would be someone who is either, elected, or not elected, but appointed by council, or, hired through a position. So you can create a process and have it go through HR. They would need to be someone who is like familiar with Robert's rules, and there would be criteria to this position. But the idea would be that they're the neutral body. They would help facilitate council conversations. It would help mediate that awkwardness of like, oh well, I agree with this person, but I don't agree with this person. And when it comes to making reprimanding a counselor for not attending council meetings or holding them accountable for not submitting their reports, this person could be that body to be like, hey, I'm sorry, you haven't respected our election code, so I'm going to have to remove you from council. So that way it also alleviates our elected officials from having to make those decisions. So currently, chief acts as chair, and with that it kind of causes some problems. So we're close to an election season. What's say for example, we have a counselor who decides not to show up for council meetings. There's no justified excuse. It puts the chief in an awkward position to be like, hey, I'm going to remove you from council if they're seeking re-election for the next year. So it means that decisions might be compromised based on their prospects of being re-elected. They might be hesitant. So if we have this neutral body, this chair, they can make those decisions without that repercussion.
I agree. Actually, I was surprised that I really see that the chief wasn't doing the chair, and you can't, to me, it shouldn't be. But, now it was, yeah.
Yes, sir.
I'll go veto power for the chief. What's wrong with that? If there's something that he doesn't like, let's say, for instance, they got rid of the conflict of interest guideline. If he didn't like that, should he have a say in keeping that there? They removed the conflict of interest guideline in August last year, August 15th. It's gone.
No.
Well, unless they changed the game, but it was in the August 15th meeting that
They proposed to have it removed. That was actually one of the topics.
The code of conduct?
The code of conduct you're referring to?
well, the code of conduct was there.
Yes.
At the same time with the conflict of interest.
Yes.
The same
That's
policy.
gone.
It's the same policy. No, it's not.
It's still there?
Oh yeah.
Some council members wanted to remove it, but the code of conduct has a clause that if you're gonna remove it, the General Assembly has to agree to an amendment. And the code of conduct also provides, you cannot abolish the code. You can only amend it. So they wanted to, but they did not succeed.
That was actually the topic of discussion this afternoon.
Earlier, yeah, this was about regarding the amendment.
This was the second time we've actually had this conversation.
This was the meeting,
It was proposed, and I believe that it was discussed.
They didn't know I see on it.
No, the OIC I think he's referring to is the transparency and accountability. I think it's 2836, something along those lines.
August 15th.
Yeah, I remember that meeting. I got yelled at. I do recall that OIC, and that was again the topic of discussion today. Yes, sir. The code of conduct is still in place. The amendments were not adopted. They did not vote on it. They that as of right now, that is still status quo. Well, we did have quorum, but then we lost quorum, and then again, that goes into one of those where if our quorum was 5 at that point, we had almost all council that was there. We could have continued the meeting. Yeah, well, just to speak to that, we've had various comments in regards to that they're too brief, and then when we previously had them, I believe it was a few years ago, they were too much in detail, and I think it was trying to find that happy medium, and I think that they're just really adjusting to what's being requested at that point.
In terms of like council meetings, is there any way that we can like put into policy that they should be broadcasted live?
The other thing, I think there was a problem regarding with having the public involved in this.
I think that was a personal issue. From a communication standpoint, and correct me if I'm wrong if I go a little too far into this, but from a communication standpoint, I don't see why we couldn't. To be completely fair, some of the discussion that was happening today was to try to have the conversation behind closed doors, to not necessarily be accountable to the people. We don't want to air out our dirty laundry to the people. I'm not sure exactly if that's how that was shown, but from a communicator's perspective, again, and this is something that I was elaborating to an individual who was actually recording this afternoon, I just reiterated to them that, and it is apparent, it's something that we know for a fact, ISC watches our live streams. Other municipalities watch our live streams. Media outlets watch our live streams. We've actually had situations where we refused to do an article or an interview with a certain media outlet. They actually went and took a screenshot of our public meeting that we were broadcasting live to our constituents, used that as the image for their article.
For the online voting system that you use for like the WhatsApp machine
Yes.
and stuff like that, is there any way that you can upload the stream onto there and so that you can log in with your
We don't have that database, and to create that database, it takes a little bit, and I don't think we have the personnel to do that at this point, but that is something that could possibly be done in the future.
That's what I was asking, had mentioned to her, is that you have people registering to view this online, and those people would be accountable for participating in community events.
Yeah, as of right now, we're using a YouTube, so we use their platform to do this. If we wanted to go along those lines and have people register and sign in and whatnot, we would have to, I believe, we'd have to create it ourselves. We'd have to create the platform. We'd have to create the programming and say, okay, here's ours, and we create the database. We submit the passwords, and then again on top of that, excuse me, it's the maintenance. It's the upkeep, you know, okay, I lost my password. I can't access, okay, well, we need to have somebody ready and available to submit you a new password to get that going. So again, the personnel, we don't currently have that capacity. It does. There's First Nations communities I know that actually, I think it's West Bank is one of them, where in order to actually access their website, you actually have to put in your band number and your name and stuff like that. But we don't have the capacity at this point.
One of the things that we can also do too is like you can listen to it in camera. So like if there's conversations even in public, we could have those in like camera conversations. So
Yep.
I think it's definitely possible and
Yep.
realistic to have like meetings shown online.
Yep.
Just because like I feel like when we have public meetings, everyone's like on their best behavior. Everyone's nice
Yep.
and pleasant, but then we hear the horror stories on the outside of what council was like when
Yep.
council was in session behind closed doors. So it's like I think that it would help kind of calm down the tension.
I believe so.
Would feel,
They're more accountable to what they say.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, legally on the Indian Act regulation, there's no provision whether or not council meetings are public or confidential, and it's not a topic that is addressed in the election code. So it would be another document for council meeting procedures, which would be separate from the election code, because I saw some election code that go into the mandate, the meetings, and it's no longer an election code. It's like a constitution. It's 300 pages because they go into all the procedures, how they hire the ED, everything is in there. So that's a little too much because it goes beyond the election. It becomes the whole system of governance, and that becomes very complicated. But I agree that it's a very important issue because you would think that on federal, provincial, municipal, all the meetings are public. So why not for a band council? You know, why wouldn't? And then if you go visit some communities now, and I'm thinking of Washat and Mistassini as an example, they rebuilt their council meeting to be public. So it would be like you've seen today. It was done specifically, but you would have permanent office facing the crowd, and you would have chairs, microphone, the whole setup like municipal. You see a city hall, right? You have the councilors in the front, the mayor in the middle, and you have people coming to each meeting, and it's part of the deal. So you can have in-camera session, and you do it either at the beginning or at the end, and then you open the session or you close it at the end. The confidential stuff, contracts and stuff like that is not public. But you can set it up physically that permanently what you saw today could be every day. The council sit. It's really a matter of how, because right now the setup is not configured to have more than 5 people to participate in a council meeting where they're located right now. So it would have to be organized. But again, it's not part of the election code and process. It's meeting procedures, which is another thing.
Yeah. But in just one final note on that concept, we actually do have the technical capability to do that right now. If we wanted to, clearly we're doing it right now, and I believe the council chambers has been retrofitted with a camera and all that fun stuff, and it's internet compatible. So yeah, it could be done. It could be done, but again, to get there. So again, we're going in with we mentioned a 4-year term. That's what's in here as of right now, but that could be changed to 3 years. We are on page 5, section 3.1. Through our online survey, again, if anybody hasn't done it, I would recommend you do. We did give the option all the way through from 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years plus, to see how that would work and if who would want what, so on and so forth. Now, each general election is to be conducted the first Saturday of June each election year. This is also something that we put into our surveys to ask when. Some of the individuals that have spoken to us at some of the sessions they just gave suggestions, so we felt we would have definitely entertained the concept through our surveys and through those types of questions. What they mentioned was, Labor Day weekend, powwow weekend, everybody's home. It would be a good time, but then others bring up the notion that you don't want to have political issues and political discussions around time of powwow, and but it's so we gave them months, and June is the status quo is still the front runner of when the elections they want to take place.
For the oath of office, 4.4, where it talks about, however, any financial remuneration and or arrears due to allergies that past council members shall be paid in full. So is that like a newly elected council member, if they had anything that they owed, they would have to pay in full?
I would say so,
Or
but
is that like talking about like any like
Because the
honorariums that were due?
in some communities, I don't know how it is in Listuguj, but you have the day of the election, let's say the Saturday. The Sunday, new council is in, old council is out, right? Here, there's that 10 days, within 10 days. So it can be the second, the third, the fourth. It's within 10 days. So for more certainty, what we're saying is during those 10 days, the old council cannot reconvene and have a one last meeting, let's vote ourselves a nice trip or, a nice little party before the end. So during those 10 days, the council that's still there technically, because you don't want to have the loop of no council, they cannot meet. They cannot take decisions. But as far as the pay goes, they will get paid until the sworn in, right? Because otherwise, do we stop paying them at the day of the election? When do we stop paying them the day after? There's going to be a debate. So it's the certainty how much do we still owe them, until what time specifically do we pay them? It's simply to avoid the discussion of when the term was up and do we still owe them money? Because if you don't provide it, people will say, well, during those 10 days, you didn't meet, you didn't do nothing. Why would we pay you, right? So we just avoid the debate by being very precise on how much you're entitled to receive.
Yeah, because I think even just from our last election, they swore themselves in. I think it was like a week or so after. So technically, their mandate ends at that time. So that's even I probably kind of misunderstood that. So that was good for clarification on that front. But staying with the oath of office, it's just outlining that is to take place within 10 days following the date of the election. The oath of office ceremony takes place even if the election is contested. So if there's an appeal that takes place, the oath of office ceremony still is to happen. 4.2 is actually a very, very interesting statement within the oath of office section. 4.2 states the presence of all elected candidates at the oath of office ceremony is mandatory, that they have to be there. So we've seen in previous administrations where individuals have been traveling and they couldn't make it, or they were not here for whatever reason. So this is stating that they have to be there. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Nadir, does this also play a role in removal? If they're not sworn in within 10 days, they are removed from office. Am I correct?
Yeah, because the election is not a confirmation of mandate. It's a process to select people. Then they have to take an oath of office, meaning that they will respect the policies, the code of conduct, so on and so forth, and they will act for the best interest of the people. They have to make that commitment, sign the oath. If they refuse to do it or omit to be there, unless they have a good reason, and then they have to do it after, it's a ground for removal. It doesn't remove them automatically, but it will be a ground for removal. They will have to explain to that process why they refuse to sign this oath of office. So because the oath of office is the confirmation of mandate. It's what legitimizes the position, especially if those guys or girls are going to be paid full time, right?
So who would be responsible for establishing the mandate? Is that through the chief? So like, are we I guess what I'm asking is this a federal system that we're adopting? Like the idea of like chief, giving the mandates to the counselors, and the counselors, pursuing those mandates under this idea of the files?
No. The oath of office will be the same for everyone. Okay. It's a sworn-in declaration that they will read out loud and sign. It's not the chief. I understand, like when there was a sworn-in with Trudeau, he gave the mandate to each of their minister. That's not going to be it. It's a common oath of office, a swearing in, where you will work on behalf and for the best interest of the Listuguj membership. So the text is not there yet, but it will be created for that purpose. But it's not something that the chief will say, all right, you're going to say this, and you're going to say that. It's all going to be the same. It's simply the confirmation that they will fulfill their mandate as chief or as a counselor.
Yeah, and from what I understand, the oath of office document has been pretty standard for the past couple of years. It's just been reprinted and.
I think for me the only reason why I'm asking is because like we keep talking about how we want them to have files, right?
Mhm.
So to me it makes sense to have the public know who's working on what file as they're being sworn in.
I believe that'd be, yeah.
That's why I was asking, because like if we're going to figure out what their mandates are, that should be included in that ceremony.
I could see that moving forward, but in regards to this now, we don't know when their mandates will actually be done and completed, especially with the work that Candace is doing. So we couldn't put it in just in case it's not, you know what I mean? We don't have it. I think so. I think we can amend that and change it, and then once we have that solidified, and say here's part of their oath of office, and kind of move from there.
But keep in mind that until such time that they're sworn in, they cannot hold a council meeting. Yeah, it works both ways. The old council cannot meet, but the new one cannot meet either. So the confirmation of mandate, as far as portfolios are concerned, will probably be addressed during the first council meetings and not before. Because technically, there's no decision making until such time that there's a council meeting. So the portfolio cannot be attributed before there's an actual OIC to confirm those portfolios.
So we're going to go into our next section, which is the by-election, section 5. This is just grounds for how a by-election will take place and how it'll be conducted. Every time one or more elected positions at the council becomes vacant, and the definition of vacant was discussed earlier, and you can go back and read it if you like. And again, see definition of vacancy, look at that. Within a year prior to the end of the mandate for this position, a by-election shall be called. So basically that's stating in a 4-year term, anything within the first 3 years, if a position becomes vacant, there's a by-election. That last year, if there's a position that becomes vacant, they'll just wait until the next election.
So just to let you know, it's usually, of all the models I've seen, there's 2 options. 1 year or 6 months. So, but considering that an average election costs $50,000, regardless how many candidates, the year seems to be reasonable because you're going to spend 50. 6 months after, you're going to spend at least another 50. So a year is easier to justify than 6 months prior to the election. But if we take the example of Lloyd, under this code, there would have had to be a by-election by now, which that didn't happen because it's not mandatory under the Indian Act. But under this, if we take the example of Lloyd, there would have had to be a by-election to replace his position. The council will not have the discretion to say, you know what, let's not have one. Under this code, it's going to be mandatory unless you're within that, meaning a year would be before the first Saturday of June prior to the following election. So if you're within that, even if, let's say, it's June 1st, the year before, you still have to have a by-election.
Who makes that call? Who would make that call to do the
Well, the rules are going to be here, and then they would just see that we don't meet we don't have the time. It's within 1 year to the day. By the code that we adopted, we're obligated to do it.
Like, how long is the mandate for the returning officer?
That's very important. Very, very important. Because of the following section. Because, and I'm not even sure if I addressed it yet. Because I've had a case, not too long ago, a client, just like you, 1 chief, 12 counselors. What happened? The chief started to act on her own, making decisions without really consulting the council. So 9 counselors resigned, all at once. So it killed the quorum. So in their election code, it stated that the returning officer is appointed by resolution of the council. So you had a legal loop because of that. So we had to resolve it in a way that there was some provision that for some reason could be interpreted that the returning officer was still under oath and still mandated, even though the election was over. So let's make sure that it's mentioned here. But you see, if you look at 5.2, it's exactly that. If the number of vacancies exceeds the quorum of 5, a by-election must be called immediately by the ED in order to fill the said vacancies and reestablish quorum in a manner stipulated in 2.1 of this election code. So in this case, we provided it would be the executive director that would call the election because the council cannot.
In the absence of an executive director, if we were to adopt, so I know, so
Yeah.
if we were to adopt the idea of a chair, could the chair ideally call that?
Could be.
Okay.
If we have a chair, that chair could be empowered to call the election. We could make sure that the returning officer is under mandate until the following election. That could be another way to resolve it. So whatever that happened, instead of the ED, we would call upon the returning officer to start the election on its own. But it would have to be clearly identified.
Because I think the part that worries me would be like, so Tina has been doing our elections for forever.
Yep.
So if we were to mandate her to stay on until the next election, she would have to drop whatever she's doing and host the by-election. So that means that any work that she's doing in her role is going to be disrupted. So like that's why I keep talking to this chair. Like I want to see the chair added to this because I think that it could help alleviate all of these.
And again, it's possible, and with the documentation that you sent me, we'll definitely forward it off to him. I just haven't had a chance to read it. Been busy. But yeah, so that's something that can be done, and he's been taking notes, going through everything. And again, we also have the video that we can reference as well. So yeah, as Nadir mentioned in 5.2, that if we ever drop below quorum, we immediately need to call an election or a by-election, and then depending on how who we give that mandate to and how that's structured will be determined. And I think that would most likely be in our next draft. So draft 4 would definitely have something concrete there to really put that in there. 5.3, a by-election is held pursuant to an election as stipulated in the selection code by making all necessary adjustments. The successful candidate elected in the by-election shall hold office for the remainder of the original term of office in the vacant position as stipulated in paragraph 3.1 of the selection code. Now, just before you go, one of the things that we've actually had individuals talk about is who is eligible to run in that by-election. So is it every candidate? We've had mention of, it based on the votes from the previous election that I think somebody said it was like the top so many are able to vote. Some people have said, well, just bump the next person up, but we just in our past election, our last one, we had 3 people tied as a 13th counselor. So then how does that work? So is there anything, and this would essentially be my question based on what I've received from feedback, is there anything that we can put in there to stipulate who can run? Because the person who was not elected chief could run then in this by-election for that one position, because it's not necessarily defined. Is there something there that we can say, here's who is eligible, or is it just anybody who wants to run?
The cheapest way would be just say, okay, the next one, the 13th person or the 14th can step up, or do the whole process over again.
That wouldn't be a good idea. For instance, that 13th person can be dead, diseased, jailed, changed country, got a job somewhere else. It would be a high risk to provide. I think, and anyway, you see, an election is mathematical. So the number of the person who get elected are based on the number of participants who voted for such person, and such person. So when you have a new election, the numbers all change. So it's always better to start all over again, and then the candidates are anybody, except, and I want to make sure that we put it somewhere in there. If it's somebody that got booted out, and there's a by-election, that person cannot run again, right? It wouldn't make sense. It would make sense that there's a removal of office, and that person would be entitled to run for his own replacement. So if it's not in there, I'll take a note to make sure that it is. I think if you look at the definition of candidate, I think it's in there. Has not been removed from office presented this election code 3 years prior to the date of the election. So we see we put it in there that it cannot be a candidate. It's a definition of candidate, page 1, F.
Could we limit it to only people who ran in the previous election, with exception to the people who were booted out if that were the case?
Problem I have with that is, you may have people who are not 18 years old at the date of the election or are now 18, you would eliminate them. So I would leave it open to just any candidate that are justified to be a candidate, and may the best person win. But to limit a by-election, why? Like, what's the concern? Anybody should be able to run, in a by-election. I just want to say, the example I gave of the 9 councillors that resigned, they resigned for a reason that the only way they would challenge the chief's action is by calling new elections. So in a case like that, they can run again because they did a political action to start new election on the basis of the action of a minority or of an individual. So those should not be punished, because you might think, hey, those guys just cost us $50,000, but it's part of their ability. They haven't been removed. It's a protest against a situation, but it's like telling the electors, look, I'm going to try again. I'm going to run again, but I don't want you to vote for this person or that person because they're not doing their job. So
this is what happened.
Yeah.
This is what happened. This is why I resigned.
Yeah. So it's different, and that's why we didn't put in a candidacy that if you resign, you're not able to run. So only if you've been removed under the removal process.
Okay, and we'll go on to section 6. It's regards to a new election. If a new election is ordered after an election appeal pursuant to section 8 of this election code, the term of the newly elected candidate shall commence, and flippy, on the date of the oath of office's ceremony following such new election, and shall hold for the remainder of the original term of office for the persons that was the object of the contestation during the said election appeal. So very technical, but just basically if I believe somebody's removed by appeal and they have a new election, that they just continue on that mandate. So if it's 3 years, that they're there for 3 years. If it's 2 years, then it's 2 years.
So that means that the date of June, the first Saturday of June of each 4 years will never change. There will always be that election at that date. There's no situation, a by-election, a new election, whatever, the term goes to that original Saturday, 4 years. So that the only way you can change that date is by amending the code. Because in some situation, the term started at the beginning. So 4 years, whenever there was an election, 4 years. Even the by-election, the person would continue, and that would become crazy because they did not provide in their code that the term was just, you always finish together and you have to start over again. So that's same situation in federal election, provincial election. When there's an election, the term is always the same. In October, in the case of the federal government, every 4 years. It's a fixed term. So you're going to have a fixed term in your code.
So moving into the next topic that we alluded to a little bit more was in regards to compensation. Now, again, when it comes to compensation, there's nothing in here that we have that states, what that is. I know that there's a mechanism that they're currently using. The only stipulation that's in here at this point is that the salary cannot exceed that of the ED or the senior director or whomever that may be. So one of the things, Nadir, that Ali had brought up a few times is that when you're talking about compensation for a member of council, we need to ensure that it's at a level that, and again, correct me if I say it wrong, but we need to have it at a level that if it's too low, somebody with financial assets could come and say, well, they'd be easily bribed because they're not making enough money, and then they are trying to find it elsewhere. Or okay, you can explain it better. Okay, hold on, I'll bring you a microphone. A little easier. I knew I'd get that one.
Yeah. So for me, one of the things that I think is important is that we compensate our elected officials in a way where they can't be easily bribed, or like there's that that they can't be financially coerced into signing something, or that kind of goes back to you'll see later on where we ask people to pay a fee in order to run. I don't necessarily agree with that either. But the idea is that if we make it so that people who are working full time, they're receiving a decent salary for this position, they can dedicate all their time to it. Someone either from outside of LNG, or someone who owns a business, they can't bribe them with goods or with any kind of services, because they have enough to kind of take care of themselves. So I remember at one council meeting, someone suggested oh, well, we should pay them minimum wage, because their heart and mind should be in it. But at the end of the day, it's most of the people who sit on council aren't making minimum wage in their day-to-day jobs. They're making whatever their salaries are. So in that's another thing where I was like, well, if we have directors who want to run for council, are they going to take a pay cut of going from a director salary to minimum wage just to serve the community? Chances are probably not. So I think that we should have something in place where they're getting adequately compensated, but like I said, not so much that they make a career out of it.
I could have said it like that.
And this would be the permanent counselor.
Yeah, a permanent counselor, so someone who has the roles and responsibilities of what they're doing, who is reporting back, whatever it is in here, yeah, so the portfolio, the reporting back. So the reporting back part, that would kind of be their timesheet. That would be them being like, hey, this is what we did for X amount of time. They would get their salary. If they don't, give that, or if they don't, attend meetings, or if they don't do whatever, they'd be deducted. So it's not a guaranteed salary, or it wouldn't be a salary. I think you said it would be compensation. But
Honorarium.
An honorarium, yeah. So
if they're making all that salary, why should they run for council or whatever if they're already up there?
Because it's not about the money. At the end of the day, it's about working for the community. But if you're making $900 a week, are you going to go down to $450 a week? No. But that's what I'm saying. So it's would you go down to a minimum wage if you're already making so much money just to go and serve the community for something that most people wouldn't? Is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And, those are people that you would almost want to be in those positions, because they've already found themselves in a director role. They're already making governing decisions. You want people like that to run for an elected office.
And the reason why she's bringing that up, Jokes, is because we've actually had consultations where people have, like she had mentioned, they said, give the minimum wage. That's what they should get. And that was the proposition, which sparked the conversation, and then the dialogue took place where, we kind of have to be reasonable in regards to some of this stuff, because like you had mentioned, it's not going to be $450 a week, and realistically, probably not. But that comment that was given by one individual at one of our consultations sparked that conversation, because they were just like, yeah, give them $12.50 an hour, do it. And then their ideology or their rationale was to then you'll see who wants to run for community betterment, because as of right now, based on some of the feedback that we have been getting, like Ali had mentioned it, some people are just doing it as a career. They do it because they know that it's a 2-year guaranteed job. They can drive around and do this job and do that job or what have you. And in this case, it'd be a 4-year job, so it's almost the rationale behind the comment is they should want to work rather than doing it to get paid for the 4 years. Because we've seen that in past administrations where people collected their $900 a week and just never showed. It's in the minutes. It's, you know what I mean.
So, under the federal statute, all elected people across the country have to display and publish their revenue. The only challenge is that there's only one figure that includes the disbursement, mileage, meals, all those things are all in one package. So you're not able really to see how much salary or honorarium was in there. But once you do the calculation, the standards of what's acceptable today, and it's a huge range, but the average is between for counselors between 60,000 to 75,000, and for a chief between 100 to 150. We're in the range of what average band council full-time position in that level. But we've seen chiefs at 250. We've seen counselors at minimum wage. So that's why I'm saying it's not a standard thing. It's more like an average.
The expenses you're talking about, it's when they travel away,
Yeah.
not locally.
No, I mean, we did have the discussion at length today that they're not considered employees of the LMG, so they don't fall under our LMG policy and procedures manual. But in there, it does state that if it's travel within like the community or what have you, that there's no compensation for travel for an employee, and they just follow suit with that. So majority of the time, the travel is actually it's anywhere outside the community. Excuse me. But just to reference that, I mean, if you look back at our last financial statements, and this kind of plays into what Ali was mentioning, we only had one counselor, and according to our last financial statements, that received an elected salary position. So every other one of them either had a job, well, actually, no, they actually had jobs that paid their salary, and then well, again, that would currently, last I was told it was around 1,100, a week, but I can't necessarily confirm because I'm not receiving it and I don't have access to it. But that's just what I've heard. So that's my, yeah. So I mean, we do have other in here. We do have travel and stuff like that. So it did lay out on the last 2 pages. If anybody wants to see them, they're public anyway. But the last 2 pages of our financial statements does show what counselors made in regards to honorarium, what they made in regards to salary.
Wasn't it 1,100 on top of the normal per diem that a counselor gets?
No, I believe it's 11 standard. Plus honorarium, I believe. I believe so. I believe so.
But the document I left you, it's written in there, so you just have to check.
So yeah, like I said, we don't know what our 2019 financial statements are going to say, but that all information is there for your consumption anyway. Yes.
For our elected officials who work full-time jobs, they have to disclose any services in their full-time jobs?
That was something that was, yes. Yeah. Our financial, and I'll
like, for example, like Martha works for personal. She has to disclose her personal pay.
So this was adopted, I think it might have been under Allison. I'm not 100% sure. But this was adopted a while back. It's been well before I got here. I'm not going to say names, but just based on our financial statements, we have counselors that their salaried position was 48,000. We have others that were 60. We have others that were 70, 80. You know what I mean? So it's listed in that context. We also have our directors. Our directors' salaries are listed, and that's been done for quite a while. So that's why I referenced the last 2 pages, because the last 2 pages, the last one is director's salary, travel, and other, and then our second last page is council. So yeah, whatever their salary is, even in their position, their work position or employed position, it's still made public. The other column, for the most part, from what I understand, and again, this is my understanding, so if I'm wrong, I apologize. It's contracts and stuff like that. So if somebody has a contract with a department, which has happened before, they had their honorarium done, and then they got a contract from one other department, and they paid them through there. So that's where other fell through. And that's the only example that I have that I know of, and I'm not entirely sure of what others there are.
So in the event that, you know, we expect our counselors to have these, you know, full-time positions, can we take contracts? Because I don't think we should be able to.
I don't know. I think that's something that we can. I think that would be laid into their roles and responsibilities, not necessarily in the election code.
So what I'm thinking is that if we have an elected official and they decide they want to become a consultant, should they be allowed to go and consult as an independent body when they already wear the hat of a counselor? So like, because in my head, I'm like, you know, regardless if you say, okay, like, I'm Allie, I work for LNBC, but I also work for the Office of Chief of Counsel. But, you know, when I introduce myself to someone, they're going to see me as whichever one they know me as. So if you're an elected official, people are going to be like, okay, this might be our counselor. They're not going to see him as might be the consultant. So I think that if we have full-time counselors, that they shouldn't have the ability to be part-time consultants on the side. If that makes sense.
Basically, you're not allowing them to dedicate part of their time to other things.
Yeah.
Because you run into conflict of interest and stuff like that, right? So if you're going to be a full-time counselor, basically you're saying that this is what your job is, and this is what you have to do.
So I plow and do driveways and weed.
Well, that's what I wanted to intervene, because we have, if there were a contract where the position is full time and it has to be dedicated to that full time, let's say 35 hours per week or 40 hours per week, we would have to say that the person cannot act as a consultant. But if the person has a business under contract with a band, I don't see an issue, unless if the code of conduct and the conflict of interest is clear. The person can still make revenue by having contract with the band, as long as the person is not in his truck plowing the driveway during the day while he's supposed to work. But if he has employees to do the work and he's getting contractual profits or revenues, I don't see an issue as long as the conflict of interest is clear.
And I think, just with that being said, I think that's kind of where we're at, where we have, and I was going to actually make the example, but you kind of alluded to it after. We've had members of council in the past miss council meetings in the winter because they're out plowing. So they're possibly receiving honorarium, undeducted honorarium at the end of the month, and they're not at meetings because they're fulfilling their contract, you know, with the LMG. So again, I think that kind of lays out what Ali's talking about, that maybe having something in there. I'm not sure if it's something in here or if it's in their mandate and their responsibilities and roles. I said that backwards. I don't know why. To state that they can't engage in that type of activity, because then it'll impact their responsibilities as council, or even maybe having that terminology in there. You can't engage in contracts if it's going to have an impact on your responsibilities as council. It's a possibility. So
does that define that in here yet?
No, and again, I don't think that would be in here. I think that would be defined in the roles and responsibilities of chief and council when they receive them from the other legal counsel that they're receiving on that. Right. And again, Nadir had also presented something as well to state, here's what this could look like, and so on and so forth.
So most likely, if the recommendation is to define that counselors get full-time position, we would probably annex the policy in the code to say, well, because we don't want to detail it. Again, it's an election code. It's not, but we can annex the policy to see these are the conditions for the counselors to receive full-time position. And this is where we will address the issue of contract, or at least being available from Monday to Friday from 8 to 4 or 8 to 5, and whatever they do, because you see you cannot forbid somebody from having a second job, right? As long as he's available or she is available during those time. But then again, keep let's say 2 weeks from now, the counselors will go to MM meeting. So they're going to be out of town. They're going to most likely have meetings in the evening. Sometimes it's on the weekend. So we cannot say that the position is 9 to 5. So, and that's the issue in an elected position. It has to be flexible, and that's where we're going to have to adapt it in a way. Maybe it's a number of hours per week, a maximum hours per week, because they're not entitled to compensation work. They're not entitled to overtime. It's not a salary. They're not employees. So we have to address all those specific conditions. But if you ask any MP that do politics, when they resign and say, I'm going to have to spend time with my family, because those guys work 7 days a week from early morning to late at night all the time, especially ministers. So if you have a portfolio and you're in charge, it can be really, and that's why you also have to pay them, because they might not just work 35 hours per week. So the compensation has to take into account that there could be a lot of hours involved, travel outside the community, so on and so forth. So the policy will have to address that.
So again, just moving forward, 7.2, if the chief was an employee of the LMG or any other employer at the date of his or her election, he or she must take a leave of absence without pay for that duration. So basically that they can't be in two places at once. They have to dedicate their time. One of the things that, depending on how we do go, 7.3 is subject to change, clearly. It says each counselor is entitled to an honorarium per council meeting as a compensation for his or her time devoted to his or her office. Now, if we decide to take the approach of a full-time position, that would essentially eliminate the honorarium. You are paid to be at that meeting. If it is 1,100 or 1,200 or 10 million, whatever it is, that's your salary. You're required to go to the meetings, and then it falls into what Ali was mentioning. If you don't attend these meetings for whatever reason, then you're deducted based on the fact that you're not meeting the requirements of your mandate. So, and that's one of the things where, when I mentioned to Nadir previously that we wanted to not necessarily use the term honorarium and go with kind of compensation, just because when you say honorarium, typically people think your once a month honorarium for you're going to your council meetings, where, to try to break the stigma that's around the term. I think that's why I kind of made some suggestions to maybe just using the word compensation rather than honorarium, because it could be confusing depending.
So a full-time salary is going to eliminate the honorarium?
Yes. Yes. So it'll be their full-time salary as a counselor, no honorarium, no additional. But again, if it comes down to it and they're not attending meetings, like I mentioned earlier, we had the individual who was missed 4 consecutive duly convened. That will impact on that on that compensation that they're receiving. So if, let's say, it's like every other band staff member, they get their compensation on a Wednesday, well, theirs is going to be significantly lower because they were not fulfilling their mandate. So, and I mean, I can understand situations where if you're away traveling for the band or what have you, but if, like we had mentioned, if you're unexcused for 2 meetings and there's only 2 meetings that month, well, or you're not in the office for 2 weeks for whatever reason, then we'd have to really look at, because they're not salaried employees, do they get vacation time? Do they get sick time? Stuff like that would have to be kind of logistically talked about, not necessarily in here, and I'm rambling and I apologize, but keep those in mind whenever, we move forward. 7.4, the chief, sorry.
7.2 eliminated or not?
Depending on how we move forward. If we say in the code and we change it to state that all 9 elected positions are full-time, then yes, it's eliminated. There is no honorarium per council meeting. It's just, we can almost change it to reflect.
Stipulated in here, like what you just saying, what you just said?
Well,
If we make the change, because as of right now, the change is not in there. It's only chief that's a full-time position as it's written right now. It's just the chief, not all council. But if we decide to take that route, then yes, that will change. Yes.
I remember a question from the last meeting I had that you wanted me to make. There was a question about 7.5.
Yes.
Where it says that the chief or council who is suspended is still entitled to receive a compensation. So in that particular meeting, they weren't really in favor of that, and they were wondering what should we do to possibly reduce it, but they're not as employees, so we can't have
you know, like what would that number look like? So if you like maybe like people to consider PI or I don't know, I don't know what you do there. Because they didn't think that if there was suspended, they would still be free. Because they can't actually make any decisions of any council meeting
If they're suspended.
if they're suspended, so they're not.
Well,
They're not governing.
for something, I mean, he might be able to really lay into that, but for me, just my perspective, I would say that if you're suspended for a reason. So that action, first and foremost, will be justified by some course of action that was taking place. So I was suspended. So I'll use the example for myself. If I was on council, I missed 3 duly convened council meetings. They do have grounds to remove me, but instead they're going to suspend me for 2 months. So I'm to not attend council meetings, but I'm still entitled to my work because I still need to do work. I just can't be at the table. You know, so depending on how that looks, you know, would really define the approach that we're going to take. So we could say, no, you're not at the table and you're not doing any of the portfolio work either. You're suspended, you go, and I'm using it as a very loose term, but you go and you think about what you did. And then they don't get compensated because they're not here. Or we can, you know, it would really depend on how we wanted to kind of lay that out. But I would agree. I would say that if you are suspended, you shouldn't be receiving compensation because you're not able to, or not as much. Yeah, definitely. You know, going forward with what I suggested earlier, just throwing it out there for your thoughts and questions and queries. If you get deducted your compensation for not attending council meetings, and let's say that's 10% per meeting, and they have 4 meetings a month where I'm suspended and I can't take part in those meetings, well then that should be 40% of my compensation gone. Or something along those lines.
So the answer specifically is at 1.24 C. There's a vacancy if the person is found guilty of a criminal offense. The last sentence says, however, during the period, so during the trial and the appeal, the council may, by order in council after consultation with the General Assembly, suspend the offender from his or her office. This vacancy shall apply even if the offense occurred before the election of the offender. This is the only place in the code that you can actually be suspended. So I'm going to put a clause when we talk about it at 7.5 to make sure that nobody thinks that anybody can be suspended for any given reason. There's only one way, is if you're on trial for a criminal offense. And the purpose of the answer to the question, why are we still paying, is because of the presumption of innocence. If we decide to suspend because the payment of the compensation has nothing to do with the crime. It's not related. So you're still paying the person because he's suspended, but he's fighting his own defense and he may be acquitted. So just think of the consequence. Let's say the trial takes 1.5 years. During 1.5 years, you didn't pay that person. Well, if he's acquitted, you have to pay him back retroactively. So instead of doing that, you take the risk, especially if it's not related, right? So you keep on paying the person. If the person is found guilty, then it's a vacancy. Then you don't have to pay anymore. But I don't see anywhere else in the code where suspension may occur.
But then when you do that, you're not going to pay it back.
No. No, but again, the offense is not... So the person during this time may be in jail and not available to go to a council meeting. But keep in mind here that the council and the General Assembly has the power to suspend the person during a criminal offense. So it will be the council's decision in General Assembly to suspend him. So it's kind of normal, because of the presumption of innocence, that even if he's suspended, he should still be able to get his compensation. Because again, it's unrelated. The fact that he's being accused of a criminal offense could be a fraud, with one of his business.
Well, I have a question then. So, like earlier today when we talked about the code of conduct, so in the event that a counselor is in breach of the code of conduct, would they be suspended for X amount of council meetings?
It does stipulate in there.
And then, you know what I mean? So, like in the event that they are suspended for X amount of meetings, you know, how does that look in terms of this? Like,
The just we have to be careful. The code of conduct does not suspend. The code of conduct suspend the compensation. We have a long debate over this when that one specific case happened. The person felt that she has been suspended as a counselor, which was not the case. The only thing that was suspended was the payment, right? So that's why we have to be cautious with the terms.
Okay.
But you know, if people are not comfortable in paying this person full time during a trial, you know, it's not a universal thing. But I'm telling you, the risk assessment that you have to make because of the presumption of innocence, that person can turn around against the council and ask for interest and damages and everything else. Is the person bankrupt? So all the consequences could, you have to weigh the balance between what if you stop the payment when you decided to suspend a person or you don't.
Is the repercussions kind of worth it? Yeah. So what we're going to do on that note is the next couple of sections are fairly logistical in nature. Well, it's talking about order in council. It talks about nominations. You know, for the most part, I want to kind of skip over those. You can kind of read those on your own time. But one of the things that we were talking about, and I believe it might have been Allie, my co-facilitator here, that I mean, you are. It's great, and I love having you here. It's awesome. But we were talking about 12.1 in regards to paying a fee, which should first and foremost should be inverted. At this point, I mean, we're not 100% on the amount as of right now, but paying in this one.
yeah, it's just 400 and then 200 for counseling.
No, on that I understand, but we're talking about obtaining signatures of 25 members for chief, which is low. And then 50 for a counselor, so that should be switched.
Can I explain that then?
What? That should be switched? Oh, sure. I was going to, but based on the track record of the night, you've been doing it quite better than I have.
Thank you. So initially what was proposed in the first couple drafts was that people would be required to pay a fee. So the fee they have outlined here was $400 to run for the position of chief, and then $200 to run for the position of counselor. So there's kind of been like this back and forth conversation that people are upset by how many people are running in our election. Where I don't necessarily see it as a bad thing, you know, but there's other ways that we can alleviate that instead of having people pay like amounts of money. So things that I suggested was that people have to get community consent. So like we would have nomination forms. So just to get your name placed on a ballot, you would have to submit as a counselor. You would have to submit 50 signatures with the band numbers, and actually go and talk to everyone, like whether it be at their house or wherever. Say these are 50 people who support me running in this election, and then your name can be put on the ballot. So that would mean at a minimum, someone would have to have at least 50 votes at time of election. Ideally, that's being very, very ideal, but that would help us weed out people who just throw their name in there for fun. It would help us weed out people who aren't necessarily committed to like having an actual campaign, and it would actually show initiative that people are going out and talking to community members and saying like, hey, this is what I want to do. I want to help represent you, and it'll kind of create a better way for us to nominate people for these positions. Because I really don't like the idea of having to pay just because $400 can be a lot for some people. I know people who don't make a lot of money and who would make phenomenal leaders. When you're young, like if you're 18, you want to run for council, I think that you should, but $200 is a lot of money when you're 18. It's a lot of money anytime. So the idea behind the signatures would be that you can still get that the way to get on the ballot, but at the same time you're also engaging community. So it's creating traction in the community too, because people will start talking about the election coming up. It brings like free awareness almost, and I think it would help increase like voter turnout and all that fun stuff.
And as, like I mentioned earlier, though, it's a popularity vote. This is where this country, followers. I don't know. I've seen some people who can get called in a lot of get up there, have not good intentions, really. They're all about me and what I can get and what I can get for my cousin, or I can. So I like the idea, but again, it's going to be based on popularity.
Well, and that's something that
Family members, I have a lot. I have a big, let's say,
yeah.
I don't have a big family, but most of our big families
Yep.
are going to be.
Yeah, and then that's something that was discussed as well, to where we even made the comment that, you know, for a member of council, so myself, I have a pretty small family on both sides, so it would be more difficult for me to do that. But then you have somebody who, I think one of the individuals that mentioned it, they're like, I'm a Metallic and a Nudgik. So that's two of the biggest families in the community. So a family supper really could just give me all my 50 signatures and we're good to go. Right? So it's something that it just, like Ali was saying, it'll really ensure that you have, you know, the support, and it's not to take away from, you know, the fact that that's going to take place anyway, because you still need to have the election. The popularity vote, or the popular vote, is still going to take place. But in order to get on the ballot, is what we're saying, is to say, here's what's required of you. Now, one of the problems that came from something like this was, somebody had brought it up actually in passing at work, was how do we include our off reserve members for that? You know, because an off reserve member, I might want to give some support. Well, I mean, I'm a bad example. I'm technically off reserve, but you know.
We live in the age of technology. It's not much to have the nomination form posted on the LNG website, have someone print it off, put the name of someone who's running, put their signature in their thing, and send you the form via email.
No, and that's possible. And again, but you have individuals that don't know how to do that, and you know. And I'm just thinking, everybody inclusive, right? So you can definitely do that. Then that's why we have it in here as right now, either or. So you can do one or the other. Just again to spark the discussion and to get people talking about the notion of being able to do that. But Jokes, you had a.
Should we have something in the conflict of interest guidelines to make sure that they don't think like that don't really go over the hand?
What do you mean?
As far as what she was talking about, popularity vote and the families getting.
Well, an election, your vote is your vote. There's nothing that could say how you should.
The conflict of interest guidelines to make sure that things don't get really out of hand as far as say one or two families, have more control. To do it that way, because let's say one of us would be related to 75% of this community.
Yep.
And the other one only 6%.
Yep. But I mean, that's something that when you present yourself based on your merit, that's where your campaigning comes in. To where if you're relying on family, sure, that's your prerogative. You can do that, but it's to the individuals to go and get out and be seen and be heard and express themselves and make sure that they're out there and expressing themselves in their platform and what they want and
so including I would say including this, they would have to draft up a platform and present it to.
Ideally, yes. And just before I hand it over, that's something that was presented even through our surveys. The surveys, people want a public debate. People want what Ali is referencing as a candidate cafe. The people want this based on just our survey data, but it's to It's to put the mechanisms in place, and even if it's going to be in here, to show, okay, here's a requirement. So when you come in and you get nominated, here's the required events and so on and so forth. And I'm gonna hand it off because I can see you're itching, and I know that she's definitely gonna want to elaborate on this a little bit more. So here you go.
The thing is that I see, counselors coming in and sitting there and just nodding your head and not really. That's why we only need 8 and not 12. You know, you have to have an opinion. In my opinion.
In your opinion,
You have to have an opinion.
Slightly
And
biased.
you gotta have something to say,
No, absolutely.
and not to sit there and nod your head, yeah.
Well,
I agree with him. Get rid of 4 dead heads.
Like, but Ali has a really good explanation to what you're referring to.
So one of the things that we talked about was I was a chief returning officer for the Dahazi Student Union. So I ran an election for 18,500 students. So in the process of doing that, what you do is where I was appointed into my position as the chief returning officer, I served they hired me really late. Usually they hire them 6 months in advance, and you plan. On top of the election, you plan debates, public forums, you plan just different avenues for you set up a communications plan for your candidates so that every candidate has an equal opportunity to get their platforms out. Candidates aren't, I can't tell a candidate to create a platform, but I can give them a platform that they can use if they choose to make one themselves. So for example, one of the things I suggested was that the comms team, or even the Office of Chief and Counsel, because they're neutral, they could help facilitate, a section on the website where it's hey, we sent out this letter to counselors. We said that if they wanted to include their platform on our website, that they had this day to submit all of their documents, and then we would post them on our website. So all of that information would become public. We could do something along the lines of having an LMG sponsored debate forum where you would, have your candidates come and they can, give their platforms instead of having different teams host their own things. We could do it as a government, and then that way it's open and equal to everyone, and they could show up if they want, and if they choose not to, that's their prerogative. And it just kind of equals out the playing field a little bit, and it also helps alleviate the cost. So there would be an additional cost to it that the government would have to assume. But it gives us a way that we can deliver a neutral kind of message that, it's open and free to everyone. And then the idea of the candidate cafe is that it's mandatory for all people running in the election. And it would be where candidates would go and learn about the roles and responsibility of council, understand what an OIC is, understand what they're signing up for, and really positioning it as this is a full-time job that you have to dedicate a lot of time to. And then hopefully that would also help weed out the people who aren't as serious. So there's different things that we could put in place, but I think what we would have to do is relook at the role of the returning officer, and either extending their mandate instead of 3 months before the election and giving them 6, but so that they can properly help facilitate and coordinate that.
And again, just based on some of the stuff that we've received already, the community already wants some form of public debate. They want a public forum where candidates will go out and speak their campaign and their platform and stuff like that. So, and as Ali stated, this could be another remedy to say, okay, well, this is a lot of work. Do I really want to get into this? And if I do, then I'm going to be committed and I'm going to pursue it to the best of my ability. So, yeah. So just going back to when we're talking about confirmation, we were mentioning it before that in order to be nominated, we're looking at separating the signatures. So if we were to do the signatures, in order to be nominated, you have to provide the 50 signatures or the 25 signatures. So we would actually move some of 12.1 over into section 10. So during nominations, in order to accept your nomination, you have to first provide that.
Is this unique for him?
Is it unique?
Yeah.
Is this done in other election codes?
There's quite a few people, isn't it? 25?
Well,
Not necessarily.
No. No?
The-
What is it?
the number of people, yes. Because if I take the example of Grand Council of the Cree election, it doesn't go as far as having 50 people, because the problem that you may have is that you cannot support more than one candidate for chief, and you cannot support more than 8 candidates for councillors. So one of the jobs the returning officer is going to have to do, especially if those things are handwritten, you're going to have to compare all those lists and eliminate if it overlaps over more than one support. If you have,
You're allowed one support?
yeah, for chief, and up to 9 for councillors, 8. So you're gonna have to, and here's the problem. If, let's say, that somebody has 50, puts a list on the deadline. If 2 of them gets eliminated because they're on somebody else's list, then you fall at 48. You're out, and you miss the deadline. So it means that you have to get at least 60, just to not to take a chance. You need more than not enough. But it's a burden to me for the electoral officer to go through the list, because you could have as many as 8 candidates for chief. So multiply it by 50. That's when it's becoming harder for a candidate to get those things, because if there's 8 times 50, you're at 400 people. And then do you get off reserve signature, on reserve? Is there a difference between the two? And how do you verify the signature? That's the other thing. Me, I'm gonna write, I got the support from one and that, but you have to sign. You have to put the Ben number as well. Like, how do you identify that it's actually the signature of the right person? So it's an idea. I still like the concept, because those who don't have a lot of money may at least get the list of support. But I would differentiate the nomination, 1 proposer, 1 seconder. Because when you talk about merging, I would make it a 2 events. So you still need a proposer and seconder on the night of the nomination, and then you have a week to get your 50 and 25 names. Or the money. Because you have a week to do so, though. 5 days, sorry. It's such payment must be done no later than 5th day. So we'll have to amend it that such payment or such signature or such list must be done within the 5 days. So at least once you accepted the nomination, because just imagine the night of the nomination, you don't know if you're going to be nominated or not. So how could you get that list done? That's a big burden. So instead, you get nomination. Okay, the way you're going to accept this nomination is either by coming up with the money or the list of support. And that's going to be the confirmation after the 5th day that you're in. And it will make sense. But like I said, big job for the returning officer to verify those names.
So like one of the ways that I think that could be alleviated is if, if the potential candidate is responsible for submitting like an Excel sheet of like this person's name with their band number, because it's easier to compare on an Excel sheet with the database, right? So it wouldn't have to be like someone stifling through all these different handwritten numbers and whatever.
Yeah, how you gotta put a signature on it.
Excel sheet,
Well, no,
when you're a 75-year-old elder, it's gonna be something else. So,
But that's
Something in notary.
but again, and then you run into the fact where are you going to get the notary to be there for each and every signature? Because I can make a list, like I know my band number, I can put my son's band number, I can put my other son's band number, and then bring it in, present it. They say, okay, this is all band numbers. It's problematic, right? So it's to define how that process would work. Jokes.
What happened to the first draft when they got 5% of the votes cast out, that they did the money back? What was wrong with that?
There wasn't in any draft, and again, that was one of the things where
The last draft was they got 5% of the votes cast
That wasn't in any draft that I'm aware of. It would be nice, but I've gone through the second draft personally myself on video, live, and there was never a section where it was something we discussed. We talked about it, that maybe that was a possibility, but that was never. Unfortunately, no. No, there was nothing along those lines in the second draft, sir. Again, I do recall talking about it.
So we had a conversation about it on one of the times that we were at the
Single hall, yeah.
And it wasn't 5%. I think it was like if someone received like basically like if you were to prove that like you ran a solid election, that you really tried, you got X amount of votes, that you would get your money back.
Yeah.
But there was never a percentage attached to it, or like it was never in the.
It was just a concept that we threw around as, again, just in general discussion to see, if that would be acceptable or what have you, right?
Well, now you have a full-time job, so you're not getting any money back.
Yeah. And that's one of the things too, where people were asking, if the feed. Well, and that goes into what Nadir had said earlier. So if we're going and we have 8 candidates for chief, keeping it one or the other alleviates the risk of saying, okay, well, we only have 400 electors. That's 400 people we need to have different support for. So you know what? It'd be so much easier to just pay the fee. You know what I mean? Same thing as a member of council. Because what'll happen, and you know full well that you're going to get people that'll just, I don't want to do the work. I'm just going to go pay my 200, 400 bucks and I'm done. Because they won't necessarily need to go out and, like we talk about the popularity vote. Somebody with a big family might just say, I'll pay my 200 bucks. I'll accept my nomination and I'll run. It's easier on me. But then somebody like we talked about who doesn't have the capital to just throw $200 into a pot, they'll say, oh no, well, I'm going to work and I'm going to make sure that I get it done.
If I believe in you, I'm willing to invest in you.
That's true as well.
If I believe that you have good intentions, you have a voice that I can hear, somebody else can hear, you're participating in community events, I see that you're out and about, I will invest in you. I will say, okay, I'll give you $20. I'll give you
yeah, and that's a possibility that, and again, it could come through. But to be completely fair, just for me, just as an example, and I'll use myself personally. If I was to be doing this, your signature of support compared to your money, I would prefer your signature of support. I'd like to see, and again, if this hypothetically, Sue, we're at a community event, and I say, Sue, you know what? Hey, I got nominated. I'm here to select I'm here to get my support. Do you think you would be willing to support? And you can be like, you know what? Get away from me, you punk. I don't want to deal with you, or I don't like the way you present yourself, or what have you. Or you would say, you know what? Like you mentioned, I believe in you. Sure, you have a voice. I like it, and we'll go from there. Or it could even be constructive in nature to say, you know what? You haven't sold on me yet. I'd like to see more from you. And then that in turn makes me work. So you know what? I need that signature. I want that signature. I'm gonna go get it. You know what I mean?
Kind of scares me with the idea of being sponsored by people. Is the idea that if I have a lot of money, I can sponsor enough people, and I could, say I have $100,000. $400 isn't going to be much to me. I can just throw it around to whoever I want. And then say the people who I gave that money to, I can hold that against them if they get elected. I could be like, well, hey, I paid for your confirmation. So that person's almost indebted to me. Yeah. And I know that.
But that's the intention that person would have. He's going to shoot himself in the foot.
But it could happen.
That's what she's saying. It could happen, and the possibilities there. So you want to try to eliminate the possibility as best you can, because it still probably could happen, but you still want to try your best, right?
If we decrease the number of support by 25 for chief and 15 for councillor, we decrease the probability of overlapping and having unreasonable result within 5 days to achieve. And it still show 25 support for chief candidate and 15 for a councillor is still a reasonable support, And I'm just thinking of a returning officer, the job that they'll have to do. because we're putting a list that can be handwritten. That's a big challenge. We have to compare signatures, and we would probably make a template form to make sure that there's the address, name, in print, signature, Ben number, just so we can recognize it.
And that's something that we probably going through the annex in the actual code.
Yes.
Say,
Yes.
Here's what this document.
Yes.
is going to look like, so
Right now it's early in the process, but eventually all the forms will be annexed to the code as attachment. Right now we're still early in the process. We don't want to waste time in doing those forms. They take time with Excel and stuff. But eventually, at the last draft, the forms will be included in the code as templates.
Would it be too much for you to have people who are calling time, and then they can just bring it into your spreadsheet that constantly being updated? Like, I know on like even just a Google Drive itself, you have more people editing them, and they get saved automatically, and they all see the same.
we can do that. Ask a 67-year-old elder who wants to contribute in some shape, way, or form to jump on OneDrive, and and that's something we like. It's I'm not saying it's a bad idea, but we have to.
Yeah, there's the off reserve.
But do they already do the
Yeah.
like they keep copies of a completed band card, and that has your signature on it.
Yeah.
So like
Yeah.
you just
But that's what he's talking about. That's the work that you'd have to go in, see my signature, go find my band card, go find all that stuff. Okay, does it match? Okay, compare, and you'd have to do that for every single person, every single candidate who brings in a paper, each and every time. You'd have to do the same. Like if I supported 1, 2, 3, 4 of you here, they'd have to check my signature on each one of the papers 4 to 5 times, just to go through the process. And that's just one person. And that's what Nadir is saying, is that the returning officers, they'd have to do all the due diligence in excess of what they're already doing. But I think it's to.
So it doesn't have to necessarily be the returning officer. Like I didn't check the banner numbers when I did it. Like, I asked the registrar to check those. So like what I'm saying is that like instead of the returning officer taking on that responsibility, they could delegate it to someone like Shoshana, who oversees membership.
But who is also a staff member.
Well,
and
that's what I mean. Like, I think a lot of this, though, like, if you were to adopt like the idea of the chair, then there's going to be additions to the pool of support.
Yeah.
You have the office of chief of council who could support in this. And we could maybe look at creating more work for different departments. If that's what we want from that.
Yeah, just because from what I understand now, even the people that do take part in the election, they take a leave of absence from their work to actually conduct the election. So, and again, it could be problematic depending on how that process takes place, but to go and ask her, to vet every one of these things, you're asking her to do her job for something where most other people have to get.
And it brings another issue where there's 3 people not entitled to vote for a reason, because they want to ensure their neutrality, the ED, and the 2. And so if you involve more people in the process, those are also voters. Those are also potential people who will run. So I would avoid putting functions in there other than those, because we know they cannot vote. But if you put the person in charge, let's say she's a candidate for chief, would you allow that person to run the list? So that's why we have to be cautious in not contaminating the code with options that are unpredictable. And so let's keep as little as possible. I like the idea of the chair, because the chair would be neutral and it can be used to call by-elections and stuff. But getting more staff and more people involved will put some questioning about the neutrality of the process, and I would probably avoid that.
Okay, so again, just moving forward, we need to have those changed or inverted. And again, at this point, if we do decide to change some things, like you had mentioned, instead of 25, maybe 15, but we'll keep the numbers in there as they are. And then if we decide to increase or decrease as we go forward, then that's no problem. One of the things that I will mention, and I know we're pretty far into the discussion that we've been having today, but we have not received too many online questions again, you are just as much a part of this process as anybody else. Your feedback is invaluable. Send it to us, ask questions. We will do our best to get as many answers as possible. The chat's there, it's available. So ask away, please. I'm encouraging it, and I'm hoping to get at least 3 or 4 questions from you before we finish tonight. So come on, meet my goal. A lot of the stuff moving forward, like after paying the fees and whatnot, does talk about notice of election and the list of candidates. This is, again, it's all, a lot of it's procedural. We can really dive into it if we wanted to, but based on the time of night, and I know that some of you are not as necessarily familiar with the document, so some of the stuff I would say, just take it upon yourselves and take a look at it, if you can. Yes. The preparation of ballots or the electoral?
No, offers of ballots.
Oh, the actual topic itself. Well, that's not in here yet.
Well, that's what I mean. That's what I'm saying.
You want to go? You want to tackle? You want to kick the can?
Yeah.
Let's do it. Okay. So one of the things that has been a very, very prominent issue, and it was brought up at the beginning of the session today, was how the off-reserve vote is to take place. Now, we've had individuals who were texting me earlier, and they were just stating 2 years and you got to come home and vote. That's their stance and that's their opinion. As mentioned earlier, again, for those of you who are tuning in, we actually talked about this at length prior to going live and just general discussion, but we're jumping back into it again. So, first and foremost, we have had individuals contacting us in the past few days, asking us what this process is going to look like. Some people, unfortunately, are distributing false information, which is very common, and they've been illustrating to outside community members that we're in fact taking away their right to vote. That is not the case. We are not taking away your right to vote. We are obligated to include you in our elections. So with that being said, we have to include our off-reserve members as well as our on-reserve members. It's just the mediums or mechanisms that we will put in place and how we're going to include them is what needs to be discussed. Yes?
The second draft, the way you had it described, was like, they had to come here to actually vote.
That was not in the second draft either. There was nothing that stated here's how the vote is to take place. That was omitted, and the general discussion took place after that. We've never had anything in there to say you have to come home.
So, what?
No, sir.
Maybe it's in the first.
Maybe.
Maybe it's in the First Nations.
Maybe.
Exactly, that's where I seen it.
Maybe, but not this one.
But for
I should double check the second draft.
the purpose of discussion, the first draft that none of you have ever seen because there was a first cut at chief and council level at the beginning of the process. Just so you know that I had put provision for in-mail ballots for off-reserve, and the council has requested me, even before consultation, to remove that section. That based on custom, that they, as elected people, they said that the membership would most likely not accept the principle of massive automatic mailing ballots to off reserve, and they should come and here and vote. And so I removed those provisions from the start.
Yes.
So going back to like what we were talking about earlier, I really like the idea of having to opt in to asking for the ballot, just because I think it would help us reduce our costs and our mail out costs.
Yep.
It provides opportunity for people like me when I was in school to
Yep.
vote and have a say still. And it removes those stragglers who aren't involved in the community, like you mentioned.
Yep.
So like I want to see it mail in ballots reflected in here. Just because like I think to completely just not discuss it in the election code is I don't think it's fair, because even if we're not removing their right to vote, we're limiting their capacity at having a say.
No, and I think the whole purpose of removing it and taking it out the first time was the view of chief and council was that the community is the community has an opinion on this, and we need to find it out from them first. So that's, from what I understand, that's why it's not in here specifically at this point, because we wanted to get the feedback. And again, through the various consultations, we've seen one spectrum to the other. But and like you said, if you decide that you want to have it situated where you have to opt in, so you have to make the request to vote, you will eliminate those individuals, like you had mentioned earlier, to where the customary thing was to send a message or a phone call and, hey, I got my ballot. I don't know who these people are. Who will I vote for? And then at that point, it's no longer an informed vote. It's a biased vote based on somebody else's opinions. You have individuals who, I've actually had people who were disconnected from the community and later reconnected state that when I got mine, I just checked names and submitted it back. I didn't know who I was voting for or what have you. They openly admitted that now they're more informed and whatnot. So we can't necessarily, hinder our off-reserve community members. For one, there's individuals who don't live in the community, but they call every week. I know we have conversations around the break table and just in the office, and one individual there says, I speak to my brother all the time, and we talk about this, we talk about this, we talk about that. So how often does that happen in certain situations? So, there may be people who haven't lived here for 10 to 15 years, but that doesn't mean that they're disconnected. Now, one of the major issues, again, that we brought forward earlier was the fact that our population, our band list grew by 900 people plus based on our settlement agreement. Now, at no disrespect, and I don't mean this in any disrespectful way again, and I apologize if it comes off this way, but after receiving funds, some of those people have never given this community the time of day after the fact. They've never looked our way, never engaged in conversation or dialogue in what we've been doing. So, and that's it's happened. We know that. So some people have the concern, and again, I'm just conveying what we've been receiving thus far. So we have individuals again stating that people that don't know this community have a say, and this is something that's been discussed and kind of debated for years. That it's not right, that they don't know the people here, they don't know the community, so on and so forth. But again, we have to make sure that we have something in place that doesn't deter, those people who are connected still, like our students who were, away. I was a student at one point, and I couldn't come home. And I made the comment at one point too, where, students who were away, I made the one comment at one meeting, and I was quickly corrected that school is done in April. University typically is done in April. May, June, you come home to vote. Immediately after, I'm not sure which one of you it was. So, but their immediate response was, what about summer intersession? What about those individuals who, and I alluded to it earlier a little bit, 830 or 860 or whatever it is now doesn't cover some rent in certain rural areas. So you may not be able to come home because you have to keep your apartment in that city, or you have a job that you've committed to, so you can't come home because not a lot of the time we may not even have had the jobs to give to our students at some point in time. I remember before where there was no student summer jobs, you had to get one on your own, right? So if there's not an incentive to come home when you already have employment, so you're not going to come home for the summer, you're going to stay there, you're going to work, which has not necessarily been always the case for students only. It's been for, some of our workers. Some of our steel workers have, there's nothing here, so they have to go to the States to work. Some of our carpenters, they have to go to the States to work. So because of this, we need to be able to include these individuals. And just because somebody, and I'll use the steel, just because somebody's on steel 8 months out of the year and they're gone for the summer, doesn't mean that they're not connected to the community in some capacity. So my personal opinion, now I'll throw that out, that I think that a hybrid buy-in where you have to request your ballot, I think that would be probably the best way to go, in my opinion, but some people may disagree. No. He might.
Good job in July 10th.
So I kind of have a radical idea, and feel free to shoot me down if it's over there. So what if we were to do something along the lines of adopting a membership code? And I know we already talked about with the membership code that we would still have an obligation to our members who are not a part of our membership code to vote. Remember, because it was like, as long as you're on as long as you're registered under the band, you were allowed to vote regardless of a membership code. So like if we created one, like that would be our list, but INAC still has their list.
Yeah, but, well, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but we did talk about this, and from what I understand, if we created our own criteria for our own membership on our own ban list, we then would be only obligated to contact our membership. So the individuals who were previously,
That's not what you said at the last meeting.
it might have been misconstrued, but
It might have been Hillary that I talked to then, because Hillary had mentioned that, you know, even if we established a membership code, that other community members, like, the status members would still have the right to vote.
What's a status member?
okay, so
INAC establishes who's our membership, right? So if we were to create a membership code, we would determine who's on our list, but we don't determine who is status.
okay, so there's other communities that have their own membership code. Now, with their membership code, they determine who is on their ban list, okay, as membership of their community.
Yeah.
But INAC
Yeah.
still has the authority to say you are status. Now, as a
Membership does not determine status.
yeah, so as a Listuguj Mi'kmaq, I have my band number starts 0510. I know of individuals that they have a membership code in their community and their status, but they're not part of that membership, and their status number is like 088 something. It's a non-band status, where they're still a status Indian according to Indian Affairs, but they're not associated to a band.
Yeah, so they can vote.
So they can't vote because our election code says that you have to be a band member and a member of Listuguj's ancestry. So if we determined and we made an election code or a membership code, then based on our criteria and what we determine as a member, our electoral list would actually shrink.
But that's not, there, like, because we have this conversation every time at these meetings, and I feel like every time we have the conversation, it changes. So there's meetings when you specifically said that regardless of the membership code, that we still have an obligation to status members.
Right now.
Okay.
That might be my miscommunication, but right now.
So with this, what I'm asking is that if we were to establish a membership code, are they the only ones who would be eligible to vote in this election?
Yes. I would say yes.
If we had our own membership code
Yes.
right now,
No. So say the election code goes through. and we
Election
have our own
code?
membership code.
and you have a membership code,
So
yeah.
the membership code complementing this, would they be the only ones eligible to vote, or would we have an obligation to status members as well?
Once
The status members who don't fall into our membership code.
once you control your membership, you decide who's the elector under your code. So it becomes your code. So if you right now, if you look at the elector, is registered on the LMG electoral list, 18 years of age. Electoral list means the list of registered LMG members who are electors. The electoral list shall be updated by the membership clerk before each election. So it's anybody on your current membership list, and a member is defined as means a person registered on the LMG's membership list. So there's the membership list, which is everybody from birth to death. And then the election list is all those people 18 and up at the date of the election. That's the election list. So right now it includes everyone who are Indians because the list comes from Indian Affairs. If one day you have your own membership list, which include people that will not have a status, because if you choose, because some bands refuse to have members who are not status, but some do, right? I know bands where they have citizens, members who are not status Indian. It exists. But those still can vote if their electoral code provides that they're eligible to vote. Okay? So you could technically, but that would then could bring some challenges with your electoral list. If you control your membership, you could still say that the election list will only be those on the list who are Indians 18 and up. So you could exclude the non-Indians, but there could be challenges. Say there's a discrimination based on the fact that I'm Indian or not under the Indian Act. But for me, I don't know any case law. What's the discrimination? It's not gender, it's not race, it's under what? Because I'm Indian or not? Well, if the custom says that we want only Indians to be able to vote, acknowledging that we have non-Indians as members, but we don't want them to vote, it would still be so far an acceptable situation because there's no case law. The case law so far only determined that you cannot discriminate between resident and non-resident. That's all. So far, the fact that you don't let Indians or non-Indians on your overall membership list vote, there's no case law at this point.
So for me, it's not so much like Indian versus non-Indian. It's the idea of weeding out people who do not have connections to community. So what I wanted to propose was the idea is like if we were to have a membership list, and if we were still responsible to providing opportunity for band members, period, to have a vote, could we include something where we say people part of our membership list would be entitled to an off-reserve ballot. However, if you are not a part of the membership list, but that you fall under the category of just a status member, that you would have to come home and vote.
A status member, when you control your list, what you're talking about is those people who are registered as Indian, but not in a band. Those cannot vote because they don't belong to the band. They're simply status Indian. So if they want to vote, they have to come and register to your list. There's no two lists. There's no one Indian Affairs list with those who are not on your list. There's only one list. So the Section 10 of the Indian Act, once you get the list, you get the whole list. There's no dual list. So right now an Indian Affairs has it. Once you request it and you have a double referendum. The first referendum is, we want to have our own list, yes or no. Second referendum, here's your criteria, do you agree with it? So there's that dual referendum. If you got it, then Indian Affairs will transfer you the list. They no longer have the list. So whatever they create, whatever they keep is those registered Indians that don't have a band. Those will not, even the person comes from Listuguj. If he comes in forward to list, I'm a status Indian, but I don't belong to a band, but I come from Listuguj. All right, fine, get your name on our list. Otherwise, you cannot vote. It's like, it's like saying, I was, somebody is born in Ontario, but now is residing in Quebec. He can no longer vote in Ontario, even though he was born there. You cannot have like that dual thing going. So for the same principle, if the band now controls the list of membership, there cannot be any other possibility of being a member if you're not on that list. The list is a monopoly.
Okay, because I think the part where I'm getting confused is that I'm like almost 100% certain that when I brought the idea of membership being like the source of voters, that there was a conversation had that there was case law that existed that prevented that from happening because it was a discrimination against people who were, offered a spot.
What year?
I just remember us having this conversation multiple times and it keeps swapping back and forth. So that's what I'm getting.
But that's between resident and non-resident.
There's not a good reason. The way you describe that, it only includes members here and not off the zone.
So what were you talking about? 19 what?
19.8 down. The way that's described, it only includes the members over here and not members from off the zone.
I think when the main or missing people who are not asking the right questions right away, when we had it shown how I don't think I asked the question in the best way. And hopefully the
The thing is, I mean, there's not to do,
No, because it's you're an elected. It doesn't specify whether you're on or off. You are an elected. So you're 18 years of age or a man.
yeah, but for people that are living 500 or 600 miles away,
Doesn't specify. When you get your your name, you still have to provide your band number, you still have to provide your name.
Yeah, but the way they have it there, it's almost saying that they're gonna come to the polling station and vote. And if you're in person, that's the way they do
The
it.
electoral officer has to record the name of each elector who receives a ballot. That doesn't say that you have to count them. When they send you a ballot, they record that you received it.
No mention there anywhere about ballot, ballot, no mention anywhere.
It doesn't say anywhere officer ballot. It just says an elector ballot. It doesn't distinguish between one or the other.
It's not like you almost have to be at the poll.
That's how you're interpreting it. That's not how it's written. Again, for each elector, the electoral officer must verify his or her name is registered on the electoral list. That doesn't specify that they have to be here. When you submit your ballot for officer, hold on, Joe. When you submit your ballot for officer, they take your ballot, they see your name, and they see your band number. So for each elector, which is an officer ballot or on-reserve ballot, the electoral officer must verify that his or her name is registered on the electoral list. So that has nothing to do with what proximity you're in. It just says that any ballot that they receive, they have to make sure that your name is on our band list.
The way that's described, it's almost making them be present.
Again, that's how you're interpreting it, but that's not how it reads.
No, but hold on. I understand what he's saying.
I do too. but
Because
it's not how it
we're
reads.
talking about mail-in ballots,
Yes.
right?
He wants it to
You're right. We did not put any provision on mail-in ballot. We excluded it so far. So if we allow that, we're gonna have to change all that.
That's what I'm saying. He's saying that wasn't even in there, but that's.
But it doesn't, again, when you're going from 1908, and we'll go through it, any elector who presents him or herself to vote at the polling stations must bring a government-issued photo identification. So here, this is who I am. This one alone says at the polling station. For each elector, the electoral officer must verify his or her name is registered on the electoral list, and he or she will be handed a ballot so that he or she can record his or her vote. That's at the polling station, but when you receive your ballot, everything is in there already.
So far, that's the only way. You present yourself to the ballot and you vote, but after you show your ID. There's no other way so far, but we're gonna add a mail-in ballot.
Yeah.
Meaning that
What I said, you're excluding them, and that's what that's doing.
excluding who?
The officer ballot.
No, because right now, the off-reserve have to take their car, the bus, the plane, and come vote in Listuguj. Right now, that's what it is. There's only
But that's
one
not
way.
what's in
Yeah,
here
that
now.
shouldn't be like that.
What do you mean it's not what's in
Again,
here
but
now?
the electoral officer has to record the name of each elector who receives a ballot on the electoral list. That 1910 doesn't distinguish between on or off reserve.
So there's a hole.
There's a gap in what's being interpreted.
There's no mention of officer,
But there's
name and
especially in 1910, it doesn't say that you have to be here either. The electoral officer has to record the name of each elector who receives a ballot. When they mail you your ballot, you are at that point they distinguish that you receive a ballot. So they mark down, we've sent a ballot.
Anyway, the way that's described.
Yeah, but right now,
It's a little weird.
right now,
It's not fair.
But that's why
the mail-in ballot, the mail-in ballot, if we put mail-in ballot, there's a whole bunch of changes we have to make.
Absolutely,
For
but there's
instance,
nothing in there that says
For
this.
instance, I'm gonna give you an example. Until what date do you have to send your mail-in ballot?
That's up for debate too, because what they do is they send everything out. They require a certain amount of time in between, from what I understand. And then when it gets to a certain point, if somebody's screwed up or if they need one emergency, so they'll send it priority mail. And then it gets their priority mail. They pay the postage for priority mail to come back. So I think it's like a week
Okay,
that they
but
can
technically,
get you a ballot and
you
still
should
take
be
part.
allowed to, the returning officer should be allowed to receive mail-in ballot until the end of the election day. Technically.
Yeah, I think they
I've
can.
definitely seen people walk in with their mail-in ballots and give it to Tina. Like, that happens. now.
Walk in with a mail-in ballot.
No,
Wouldn't that be a
like, so for
contradiction?
example, like, if I live in the States and I'm the only one able to come home and there's like 10 people there and they're like, hey, I know you're going home. Do you want to go and bring our ballot? I know people who have given their things and the sealed
Sealed ballot,
envelopes
Yeah.
to be given to Tina.
Okay.
So like, they're like people will pass it in on the day of in that case.
Yeah.
Like if it's not something that.
So that's what we were saying. We did not review the code on mail-in ballot package yet. We would have to, if we accept to do that, there's a couple of provisions that will be modified.
Okay, so-
What I was saying.
So it doesn't mention that there is mail-in ballot.
No, right now, Like I said, I was told by council to remove that package, so I removed it.
But you can't.
Right now, you can only come in and vote.
As it's written right here. Okay,
As
so
it's written right
that's my fault. That's my misinterpretation. They still can vote. They just have to be here. That's
Yeah.
basically how it's written down.
That one there, which is right.
That's both of them are like that because I'm looking at the third draft. and
It
the
hasn't
exact same
changed.
provisions
Yeah.
are the same. So they have to
It
be
hasn't
here.
changed from one draft to the other. So if the consultation makes it that you agree to have mail-in ballots to those who request it, we have to modify some
They
provisions.
will have to agree, there's no choice, right? They have to agree on making ballots.
Who has to agree?
Council.
Well,
No.
if the consultation shows that
If the
that's what you
consultation
want,
shows that, like,
we'll,
to be
we'll put
fair,
it.
If we went just by our survey data, the survey says that they want you to come over and vote.
Well, it's not right.
No, and again, I agree. I still think that there should be provisions in there. And again, that's probably my misinterpretation of your question and what's written in there. So I apologize for that. But if we went based on just the survey data, yeah, they said they want you to come over and vote. But logistically, that doesn't make sense. Based on the testimony that we've got here from Ali, from a few other people, and many other consultations that no, you can't do that. Like I mentioned with Pancho's daughter, Amanda's in Germany. To tell her that she's got to pay the $3,000 to get home, just to vote, just to go home, and then and again you have the very very firm come home to vote. Well, they'll stay home and don't visit parents. But it's still the $3,000 to get home at that time doesn't make sense. You know what I mean?
And if you also go through that, it mentions the 5%, like, for paying the money, that if you get 5% of the votes, if you go through that, you'll see that it says that you're getting money back in there somewhere. Which is really.
In the second draft, but this draft, I don't know if it was that.
I never drafted that
We
you get
didn't-
any
we
money
didn't
back.
even draft. That's not even
I didn't
the
even
first
draft it.
vote asking
I'm
for
the one
money.
who drafted it from day one. I never put a 5% in there or any type of reimbursement.
It's going to be in 12. It'll be,
Pass it over.
Well,
That's where it's at.
confirmation. Paying a fee of $400 cash, obtaining blah blah blah. 50 members supporting nomination. Such payment will be done meeting at 5 p.m. Atlantic standards. For more certainty, any nominated person who will not have paid the fee on time will be deemed refused his or her nomination. At the end of the period provided, section 12.1, the selection code, if one candidate has been nominated for the position of chief, that's basically saying that we have one person running for chief, they'll automatically get in.
Is that the second draft you're reading?
Yes, sir.
You're playing something.
Or wait, I want to confirm. No, here we go. Here's the second draft. Sorry. Let's go through. Because I read through it and I don't ever recall seeing it at all. Okay, so confirmation. Once the nomination period is closed pursuant to paragraph 10.3 of this election, the first nominated candidate's position has to confirm that they're accepted by paying a fee of $500 for the position of chief and $250 for the position of councilor, payable in cash only to the electoral officers. What, they won't accept money with? Such payment must be done no later than the 5th day following the date of the nomination meeting at 5 p.m. Atlantic Standard Time. For more certainty, the nominated person who will not have paid the fee on time will be deemed to refuse his or her nomination. At the end of the period provided in section 12.1 of this election code, if only one candidate, again, is going to say if there's one person that runs for chief, they get it. Where more than the required number of candidates are nominated for each position to be filled, we declare the election to be held. Notice of election and list of candidates, so there's nothing that says anything in there in regards to confirmation. That's it.
And
Second draft?
Yes. This is the second draft here.
even at section 16, withdrawal of a candidate,
Yeah, but it's still to his point. I want to make sure that it's at least clarified.
even in the withdrawal of a candidate at section 16.2, we don't even pay the money back if the candidate decides to remove his name after the nomination. We don't pay him back.
The only time that it talks about
And the only
fees
time,
and confirmation.
when you look at it logically, you would only know the percentage of the vote after the count is done, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we're not reimbursing anything.
Where would that money go to?
The money finance the election.
Yeah.
It
That's
goes,
what
it
we're-
does 50,000 of an election cost.
Because our last election cost us $57,500.
It helps with finance it.
Now I'm not sure because Al and I have had the debate and the discussion whether or not we receive
Before
funding
everybody
dollars.
goes, for me, it's important to have some feedback on section 23. Because more and more First Nations are taking that system. I want to know what you think. And it goes like this. the candidates for chief, the day of the vote, when you count them, if none of the candidate got 50% plus one, you take the two runners, the first runners, and you have a second term a week after to determine who's going to be the chief. Because more and more First Nations are saying, we want the chief to be elected by the majority and represent the majority of the community. And that's why they're having this second term.
So you would have two elections for that one position and you want to they don't have to go.
Yeah.
Which is
So
problematic.
couldn't we just switch that and ask for proportional like representation instead? Like to like have them like
No, but
so we have 6 people running, we could put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You know, list them by top priority and have calculate votes that way.
for chief,
Well, yeah, it would save you from having to do more than one election, and it would just it's a process of elimination. So it'd be like the people with the last two, like the least two would be eliminated. Their second ballot would go and be distributed upwards to the next candidates, and then the person with the least amount of votes at that point, their third ballot would be distributed to the two candidates. And it's an election process. Like,
Yeah.
It's a type of election.
National chief is like that.
yeah.
Yeah, so you could do that. It would save you.
That could be an
from having
idea.
to do,
But the idea is to avoid is that there's some First Nations, their tradition is never more than two candidates, you know. But we've seen elections with 9, 10 candidates for chief. So technically, somebody can be elected with 30, 35, 50 votes out of a population of 1,000, because not everybody votes.
You're saying 50 plus 1, you mean the votes cast?
Yeah.
Well, the last election was only 40%.
That's fine. So let's say
40%.
there was 1,000 votes. The person would have to win with 501 votes. If he doesn't have that number, there's a second turn with the two candidates. So you're sure that at the end of the second turn, one of the two gets at least 50%.
So it would be half plus 1.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what he's saying is that if there's 4 candidates, and this kind of leads into what he was saying too. If there's 4 candidates, and I got for chief, I got 20. Let's say I got 39% of the vote. Alan got 38% of the vote. Sue got 36%, and then you're over 100 or whatever. You know what I'm saying? 20. But we ended up, and then the 4 people do it. I don't attain 50% plus 1.
There was
So
a major fraud in your election.
Yeah. Talk to my returning officers. That's what I think.
It's a new election right there.
But and then so the bottom one would get dropped off, and then they would then say, here are your next candidates. Seeing as that we were all relatively close, we'll do it again for these 3 candidates, and then we do it until we attain 500 plus 1.
The idea is that you want a chief to represent the majority, because some chief will then go on the media and say, I represent my community, right? But the majority did not vote for that person.
But our chiefs are all overrun by council anyway. The chief is just a chairman pretty well.
Well, and that's where it changes the dynamic. I'm
So-
telling you, it changes the dynamic. Those communities who do that, the chief can talk to a counselor and say, dude, I got more votes than you.
That's why our chief needs veto power.
Because right now,
But
on
with
average,
that, though,
the chief
you could have
counselor
veto
gets
power.
always more vote than the chief. Depending on the amount, on the number of candidates for chief, the chief counselor gets always more vote. So then there's a debate. Geez, the chief counselor has more vote than the chief. The legitimacy is challenged, right? Anyways, I wanted to hear you on that, because I'm telling you, there's more and more First Nations are doing it. This model of instead of having this
We should have
one
caught
shot
that
only.
at the beginning. My brain must.
Yeah, and
Yeah, I understand.
that's one of the things to where
9 o'clock.
We do-
A whole bunch of people.
Can
do it
we? I'm coming back on the 21st. Can we have another session on the 21st?
Is it on the calendar?
I didn't email it to you.
It might, if it's over a week, it's not going to be there.
Oh, not on the phone?
Yeah, it's not going to be over there. It's not going to be over there. It's going to be over a week.
21st is Tuesday.
We don't have anything scheduled for Tuesday. But yeah, I don't see why not.
I'll be there, so we can resume the thing.
Sure, we can do it again on Tuesday.
Do another
Next
session.
one would have been the 23rd.
We'll just switch it. We'll switch it from the 23rd to the 21st, and then we'll go from there. Sound fair?
So.
Do we have quorum?
I'm just telling you though, you probably heard, I'm here the 23rd of the day for a council meeting. If for some reason there still need to be a public council meeting with regards to the code of conduct,
Yes.
then it's scheduled to be in the evening, just to let you know. So it could be bumped up, my presence could be bumped out because if there's a public council meeting.
Okay, well then what we'll do is we won't necessarily make the change until we get closer to the date.
Exactly.
That'll be fine.
We'll know that same day.
Okay. So moving forward, if there's anything that you guys have later on in the election code, send us an email, send us a Facebook message, do what you need to do to try to contact us. We'll do our best to answer questions. Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you everybody online for tuning in. I'm not entirely sure how many online viewers we had, but for those of you who did tune in and did possibly take some notes, I thank you. This is going to be on our Facebook or our YouTube page, so if you know somebody who missed it or you came in late, you can go back and watch the beginning of the meeting at any time. I encourage anybody here to go back and watch the meeting at any time too if there's something you would like to reference. And thank you for your time, and have a good night.